Hi, Amo.
Hey, everybody.
Hi, Governor.
How are you doing?
Doing okay. How are you?
I'm doing all right, too.
Good to see your face.
Yeah, likewise. Likewise. Everybody's face. Peter, nice to see you.
Hello, how are you,
Hi,
Julie?
Peter. Why don't I? Oh, hi, Peter.
Hey,
Hi, John.
Morning, Julie. Good morning, everyone.
Hi,
Good
Dr.
morning.
Coley.
Hello, how are
Good
you?
morning.
Good morning. John, I like the new facial hair.
Yes, it's my pandemic facial hair.
Seems like a thing. Seems like every guy has this going on.
That's exactly.
You know, it's true. It started out as just laziness, right? Like, what's the point of shaving? And then I just went with it. It's funny, I had this about 20 years ago, and the strangest thing, it's much grayer now.
Go figure, right?
For the record, I had mine before this started.
Is that Doug? I hear you,
Yes.
Doug. I don't see you.
Me
I'm
neither.
here. Is my everything working?
It may
Yes,
just be.
Yes.
Okay.
even the facial hair.
Yeah.
Hi, Saru.
Hi, Julie, how are you?
How are you doing? How's your knee?
Much better, thank you.
Oh, good.
I'm running again, which is really
Oh,
amazing.
Oh,
Yeah,
that's great.
that's fantastic.
yeah, thank you. How have you been?
Okay, hanging in.
Yeah, crazy times.
Yes. Hi, Mary Kay. We see you.
Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Great to be with you in community, even if through technology. It's great.
That's right.
Really good to see people's faces.
Mm-hmm.
Been reading a lot about you, Mary Kay. Very inspiring.
Yeah, thank you. And Saru and I were together in a park where
Yeah.
she's making wage justice and racial justice for, yeah.
Fantastic.
That's great. Hi, Abby. Hi, Georgia.
Hi, everyone.
Good morning.
Hey, Betty.
Julie, are you spending most of
Good
your time in
morning.
LA?
Yes, yes.
Mhm.
Yeah, very little travel now.
Yeah.
I assume that's true for everyone, huh?
Yeah.
Hi, Betty.
Hi, Julie. How are you?
Betty.
So, Julie, I have to tell you, you're just amazing. You're always smiling. No, seriously, with everything on your plate.
I'm masking a lot of anxiety.
Your smile mask.
It's either that or cry these days, right? It's
Oh
better
my
off
gosh.
smiling.
After the news this morning, you're kind of like, oh, gosh.
Yeah.
Isn't that every day? I feel like it's
Yeah.
every day.
Every
It
morning.
is every day.
After the news this morning.
Well,
Unfortunately, the problem you have to ask is which piece of news this morning?
Right.
it's the economic news, but it's just,
Economic news or the
Yeah.
opportunity to postpone the election?
Exactly.
that one I was kind of expecting. It's like, nothing's beyond him now, so.
This is true.
Hi, Roy.
Hello. Sorry, muted more than one way.
I'm just looking to see who we have because we might want to get started. I see Lance
Yeah,
and Ash and Mariana.
sorry, Julie, I have the list. So the only two that are not on yet are Tom Khalil and Henry Stern that we know, the other than folks who said that they weren't able to join.
Oh my gosh, thank you, Amol. That's helpful. Okay, so I think we should jump in. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah. All right, so thank you all so much for being here. I think I speak for all of us. It's nice to see everyone again. Our work was put on pause at a moment when I think we were all, it was challenging to figure out exactly where we were going to land, but very, very exciting after the many months of work together. So it was with, it was unfortunate that we had to pause when we did, but I think it was the right thing, and it's really nice to reconvene with everybody again. So, Amol, should I just jump in? Do we want to?
Yeah, please.
Oh, okay, thank you. So we're going to do a few things today. One is we are going to share what the governor's task force on business and jobs recovery is about and what it's been doing, mainly with an eye to looking at what the complementary and intersectional nature of it is with the work that we're doing. And then we're going to have a conversation led by our co-chairs about our work. And then we're going to have Londe lead us in discussion just about how our work has been really, changed, transformed, but largely, I think many of us have said this, right? Accelerated. The urgency of it is even more than ever through COVID. And then we'll talk about some next steps. So I hope that makes sense. I just realized in looking at Mary Kay's lovely face that we did not do what we normally do, which is think about how we should all introduce ourselves and say our word, which I love so much. So I'm sorry. It's a sign of just my utter being overwhelmed here. So I just want to apologize for that. And I think I'm going to jump right in because we have limited time today, if that's okay. Okay. I see Peter nodding. I see Dr. Coley nodding. Okay, so I'm going to start and just do a little bit of grounding for us on the task force. As everybody knows, let me just say, where we left off was we had submitted a timely update to the governor on May 1 about our work, and what we said is that we would continue our work after this pause and submit a final report by the end of the year. So. In the meantime, the governor set up this task force on business and jobs recovery, which has about 100 individuals. And the idea was to really help advise the administration, advise him on the dual COVID-induced crises of public health and economic health. And the group is really advisory in nature. The idea is to generate ideas, to amplify advocacy on certain things that the state wants to do, as well as to draw from resources across the state to meet the immediate crisis at hand. So I'm just going to share a little bit of the task force's work, goals, and progress, and then we'll talk some about how it intersects with the work of the commission, and then what remains of the commission's work in light of the creation of that big task force. So as an initial matter, from the very beginning of the task force, there was a very intentional effort on the part of the governor, the governor's office, and all of us to make sure that the task force benefited from the work of this commission. We did a really early briefing with co-chair Tom Steyer. I know Tom has been in regular contact with James and Mary Kay as well, and we shared the commission's update. And one thing that was both heartening and devastating was the knowledge that COVID really drove home more than ever the importance of everything that we were talking about, right? The need to focus on equity, the need to center solutions on working people and the well-being of working people, right? The whole, we have been talking about how critical worker health and welfare was to the resilience and stability of the economy. And now we mean that in even more literal ways about worker health and, you know, the ability to stop the spread of the virus. And then, you know, another piece of what the pandemic really revealed is something we've talked about a great deal. You know, Sardu and others have lifted it up regularly, which is the inextricable link between economic justice and racial justice, and economic security, and the need to combat racial inequity. So the work of the task force is broken up into subcommittees, and that's where really much of the work takes place. The task force itself as a whole meets every 2 weeks, and those are mostly for updates, but the work takes place through subcommittees. And I, along with James, are co-chairs of the Economic Equity Subcommittee, which was explicitly formed to keep the values and plans of the commission connected to the task force. And then Anish and Lande are the two key governor's office senior advisors who support all of the subcommittees. So again, you know, sometimes when we work on the task force, we think of it as they're like mini reunions of the work that we've done here. We've tried to be very true to that in the work and the ongoing evolution of the task force. You know, there's lots of questions about the task force, and frankly, all of it is evolving on a constant basis. So we always, you know, thank the task force members, and we ourselves are always hearing, you know, part of the challenge and the goal here is, as it has been for the last 4 months, is to be as flexible as is needed to respond to the many changes that are constantly hitting us. So then, in addition to my role and Anish and Lande, 5 of our members are actually on the task force. They're Mary Kay and James, our co-chairs, and Maria Salinas, Lloyd Dean, and Art Pulaski. And I'm going to ask them to share a little bit about their experiences also shortly to get a better sense of the interconnectedness of the work and, you know, what remains for our work. So, of course, the questions about how our work remains relevant and additive and complementary to other work going on in the administration and the changes brought on by COVID, I know are, you know, on everybody's mind. And so we want to have a chance to discuss that with everybody today. But the task force is primarily focused on meeting the specific moment we are in, the COVID response and the COVID recovery, which means that the commission's original charge of developing a social contract for California's workers for the long haul, that remains as important as ever. And so, you know, we wanted to reiterate the importance of that work and say that, you know, beyond the short-term recovery issues, that all of the proposals, the recommendations, as well as the identification of challenges, you know, again, we've used them in the recovery work and in the task force, but they're also just, you know, more relevant than ever in terms of our being able to put out a meaningful report with ideas about what we need to do going forward as a state. The task force is chaired, as I think everybody knows, by Chief of Staff Ann O'Leary and by Tom Steyer. It meets every other week as a full commission, as I mentioned, and then the subcommittees do every other week meetings also, where ideas are generated about related to certain topics. So we started with 10 subcommittees, and they were recently collapsed into 5. And those 5 are innovation and climate. A lot of the focus there is on telework, telehealth, and on climate. You know, one of the things that is kind of an interesting, you know, kind of side effect really of the pandemic is the effect on the climate, with so much reduced travel, reduced commute, and the like. And, you know, I think we've had members of this commission talk a lot about telework, and, you know, again, all of that has been accelerated by COVID. The second subcommittee is called Financial Systems and Infrastructure. It's really focused on banks, on small business lending, and on new infrastructure development, especially as it relates to housing. The third subcommittee is just called Recovery. That focus has really been on amplifying the public messages around public health, and, you know, specifically, and hopefully, you know, everyone here has heard, but we have not done a good enough job reaching especially those vulnerable communities where spread is really a problem right now, but on amplifying the message about mask wearing, physical distancing, and the like. That subcommittee also has a focus on testing, right? Making sure that there is, advising on policy that we have in the administration around how to ensure adequate testing, adequate turnaround times for testing, equitable access to testing and the like. And then they also, we as a state have really taken on the challenge of trying to provide more PPE. We were, I think, slow to solve, but that was true everywhere, across the world really, but certainly across the country, right, with supply chain issues. But some of that work is also happening to try to leverage the task force's help and resources for that. The fourth one is called small business, right? This is a big focus, ensuring that small businesses in this time have the support that they need. And the fifth is equity and workforce. That is the one that Mary Kay is on, that James and I are some of the co-chairs on. And what we're doing is really developing proposals that expand equity and opportunity for workers, focusing on the demand side, that and making sure that we're connecting reskilling to where the jobs are, looking at also how those jobs have changed or expanded based on COVID or how they have not, and ensuring equity principles across the entire task force. So we talk a lot about job quality, and we did propose equity principles that were adopted by the task force as a whole. And Mary Kay will talk a little bit more about some of the proposals that are generated there. But just to give everyone a sense of what the task force has done, I think that will give you a better understanding of its role, because I think there's been a lot of confusion. One is that when we issued sector-specific guidelines when we started to reopen the economy in about 32 different industries. So the task force was charged with helping to give us feedback on those guidelines, right? The task force is very broad in terms of its representation, multiple industries, employers, unions, and so giving feedback on the guidelines before they were issued was one role. A second was a letter was sent to Congress, signed by 91 members of the task force, calling for more federal funding for states and local governments. Another has been just helping to promote and expand the Wear a Mask campaign. We have folks on the task force who represent, broadcast and radio, digital platforms. People donated retail space to get the message out. There's contacts with celebrities, influencers, and the like who've helped make videos. So some of it was just message amplification. And then there was a specific campaign launched called Shop Safe, Shop Local. This was mainly led through GO-Biz. So a nod to our dear friend and collaborator, Lenny, for his legacy in the ongoing work of GO-Biz. But the Shop Safe, Shop Local campaign was really meant to promote local businesses during the recovery, and a toolkit was developed for local businesses about both, sort of how to advertise and how to open up safely. A couple of the things that are on tap that are being discussed. One is a jobs platform. I know this is of great interest to people here because it's something that does connect, workers and the workforce to how we get jobs and how we train for those jobs. We're really focused on making sure this is not just a typical jobs platform, not something that we just, people can just go up and search for any kind of jobs, but there is a real connection to job quality and equity, making sure that the tool connects job seekers to good jobs and opportunities, as well as to training and learning paths, and focusing on ensuring that those paths are connected to some kind of job as well. So trying to be a much more robust jobs platform. And it's not gonna, it's not gonna be something that we can release right away because of all those various pieces and how we're trying to do something different with it. And then the last piece is just tackling the digital divide. I know, I think everyone has seen, again, in an accelerated way, how devastating that is, especially with school closures. So really working to expand access to the internet and devices that are essential for California's children to stay connected, especially, I don't think I need to say more on that, but it's a really big challenge. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to ask Mary Kay to share a bit, and then after Mary Kay shares, I'm going to ask Maria to talk a little bit about the task force, and then Lloyd emailed this morning to say that he was pulled away at the very last minute. He planned on being here too, and he's not. But Wade is here. Wade has been with us through, I think, almost all the commission meetings, right, Wade? And Wade is going to share a little bit from Lloyd's perspective. Art Pulaski is also not here. He sent a message of regret, but then we'll close with James giving some comments too, and then take any questions about the task force. So Mary Kay?
Julie, I'm curious if you're willing to, let's open for questions now, given what you just laid out, and then maybe Wade, myself, and Maria can be more specific. I think what we're trying to do with the commissioners is ground you in the work that the task force is doing that might help fuel how we would tune up our final recommendations, that we wanted this briefing to sort of get your juices flowing to consider how we land on the recommendations, given that our final recommendations meeting was disrupted by COVID. So I don't know if you agree, Julie. I think it'd be great to, I just wanted to say for myself personally, I come to this gathering with all of you with another source of grief about how we were onto something that got disrupted by public health, then economic, and now a racial justice uprising that this country needs to reckon with. That I hope that in the midst of the grief and rage that many of us feel, we can seize this as an opportunity to go bolder than we were imagining even back then in January, because the crisis has surfaced into the consciousness of white America in a way that it had never existed before, one, and two, the deep economic and racial inequality is on full display. So I think what we're trying to do is lay a foundation of the task force and then return to what we were thinking in terms of our problem statement and recommendations, and then set up for the final meeting. But I just think because Julie gave us so much meat, instead of adding more on your plate, I'm happy to just do a round, Julie, if that's all right with you, and let people kind of reflect on how you come in to this, and then what's if we could just gather the questions, then maybe Wade, Maria, and I can interact with all of them. So can we just go around in the squares? Does Peter mind going next? And everybody sees the squares like I do, right?
I think the squares might be different orders. So Mary Kay, I'm happy to have you take, go ahead and go through the squares as you see them, and maybe
why don't you
have to track to make sure we get everybody.
Okay, great.
I'm so sorry.
Peter.
Before we do that, can I just do a point of information? Is what you said, Julie, written down somewhere, or a lot? Is there anything we can look at while we're talking? Are the 5 committees written down somewhere? Sorry.
That's a great idea. Thank you, Saru. No, that's a great idea.
That is a great question. I am going to see if, I see you, Londe. I know Londe's trying to get in. That's perfect.
No, we don't have them written down somewhere, but I can certainly write them down in the chat box if that would be helpful for people, just to be able to think about the structure. Did you also mention, Julie, the operations committee?
I did not. Londe, go ahead and talk about that. I'll write down the subcommittees while you're doing that. Or
I can talk about the operations committee.
Perfect.
The task force was structured into these committees in my mind as a way to milk the experience of a new version of civil society that included CEOs, labor union representatives, community organizations, and philanthropy and government. Those were like the 5 sectors, and we were divided into subcommittees, sometimes based on what our preference was and sometimes based on what the governor's team needed from us. And the subcommittees were supposed to generate ideas of short-term interventions on the public health and emerging economic crisis. And we were asked to think about what was called back in March, April, phase 1. And we're now being asked to think about phase 2, which is between now and the opening of school and then the end of the year. So it's very kind of right up in your face thinkings about how to intervene. And each subcommittee has then been submitting proposals, and the operations committee, which is representatives from each subcommittee, tries to look across and then prioritize what gets either the governor's attention or the private sector's investment. And the 3 priorities that are being worked on right now are closing the digital divide for 1.5 million California children. The original thinking was we would do it over 3 years. What the task force is trying to do is get it done in the next 4 weeks. so that every child has connectivity, a device, and training and support for the entire household to understand how to use the technology. And then the second thing is this public awareness campaign on the measures to prevent the spread and to stop losing lives. Wear a mask, social distance, wash hands. And then the third initiative is this jobs platform that I think is the sort of opening initiative to major job creation that everybody agrees we need. And so the operations committee serves as a advisory group. I think Londe and Julie, it's a little mysterious, that part of it to me, to the governor to help figure out priorities. So are the oh great, they're now in the chat. So who wants to reflect and ask a question? Peter.
You should, Mark Benioff, my CEO, is on also a member.
Yes.
Not surprisingly. And in support of that, as Landy knows, I've been putting together an effort to do actual serious forecasting of the dynamics of the virus at the county level statewide. Landy, you don't know this, but we're actually starting, we've now set up the relationship with Larry Brilliant and the forecasting group, and we have now the economic and demographic scenarios defined. And starting Monday, we'll begin forecasting at the county level that will be able to provide the commission detailed forecasts for every county in the state. And we may even be able to get down to the neighborhood level. We don't know yet. But to be able to manage going forward, these will be 6 to 9 month forecasts that we'll be doing on a rolling basis every 3 weeks that we'll be providing to the task force in the governor's office. All of it is public. They're based on a set of scenarios that we've been doing at Salesforce, and I'm happy to share those with the committee, with this commission. The next iteration will be available on Monday of next week.
Great, thank you, Peter. Soraya?
Yes, I was delighted to read the materials that you shared. And I think the question that comes to mind, because there seems to be a focus on the largest employers, but one of the things that we have through our work that that surfaced was the mid-size employers. And are there differential ways in which they would engage with these recommendations so that it's not one size fits all? And I was particularly interested in terms of in relation to the notion of creating pathways to quality jobs, and that being associated with the largest employers and the largest technology companies. And when we know that would take only a slice of the population. So the bigger question I have is the focus on building capacity for individuals to take advantage of these opportunities.
Great that we can address that, and it's great to, I'll make sure to note and follow up. My squares now have John, Saru, Jennifer, and Wade for Lloyd. John? I can see he's very focused in getting off mute.
Thank you, Mary Kay, for that. I was actually not even aware that I was on mute, but my dog is barking here. So apologies for that. But could you please prompt me, what is it that we are now being asked to respond to?
Based on what you heard from Julie on the task force, is there a question about the role and relationship between the task force and the commission that you want to make sure we address? Or just a reflection on the current moment that we're leading in? Either is fine.
if I could just jump in and amplify Mary Kay's answer to that, we have, so this is our first meeting of the commission again, and we have until about 1 o'clock today. So this part of the conversation was really going to end in about 15 minutes. So we wanted everyone to have a sense of what the task force was doing without overly focusing on the work of the task force, because there's still remaining work for the commission itself. So I think what would be great, if you don't have, anything on the task force itself, is to really hear your thoughts on the commission itself, right? What you see as the remaining work, the urgent work, in light of where we are.
Great, thank you. That's really helpful as well. So like Peter, one of my CEOs, John Grant from Local 770, is part of the task force, and I've had the opportunity to help support some of his engagement with the task force. And so I'm a little familiar already with the workings. And I think what's really been clear to me, and I think as Julie underscored at the beginning, the centrality of equity in the work of both the task force and our commission has really been underscored by this crisis. As we discussed at the beginning of this, the so-called essential workers who are on the front lines of making sure our economy is able to function on a day-to-day basis. Obviously, we've gained a sort of new awareness and a new understanding, not just of the role of those workers, but specifically about who is doing that work and the disproportionate burden that's being borne by those workers in their communities. And that's why I think the takeaway that I have so far from my understanding of the task force is really sort of reinforcing what I had come to believe up to the point that we arrived at in March with this commission. And that is, there's a lot of things we can do to try to address the crisis facing workers in our state and more broadly. But fundamentally, the role of government, the role of the public sector in enforcing the laws and ensuring that that there is fairness to the extent that there can be, and without the ability of having healthy and safe workplaces for our so-called essential workers who sometimes don't feel like they're being treated very essentially, our economy broadly is not going to restart as quickly and as dynamically as it needs to. And I think to the extent that we can really underscore the role that, in some cases it may need, maybe if a case of Cal OSHA and other departments needing more resources, in some cases it may be needing stronger authority. But whatever the case, right now, as the representative of a union that represents workers in meatpacking and places like that, we have had over 14,000 infections of UFCW members in meatpacking alone, and 65 of those people have died. This is absolutely central to the most fundamental role of the public sector, of unions, of our society. And I think we've just got to take it to heart that, I'll stop there because I could say a lot about this. But fundamentally, I think we need to rebalance the power in the workplace, and government is at the center of that.
Thank you so much, John. Saru.
Cool. Thank you for doing this. It's helpful to hear about the task force and think about it with regard to the commission. I'm going to talk fast because it feels like there's a lot to share and ask. So I kind of the way I've been thinking about the pandemic also, as you said, Mary Kay, like horrible crisis, incredible opportunity also for change, and also to drive the things we were working on even bigger than in the commission. So one of the things I had been hoping to move with some of you as part of the commission, and some of you came to that event in San Diego, was incentives for high road employers, maybe starting in our industry and then expanding to other industries. With the pandemic, we were able to work with Julie, and many thanks to Julie and Abby for helping us make this happen, to launch a program with the governor called High Road Kitchens that is providing cash grants to restaurants that commit to moving through our equity program, increasing their equity standards, also provide some free meals to the community, And so it's a win-win. They get uplifted as high road employers. They commit to increasing race and gender equity in the restaurant, including wage equity. And they also provide some free meals. And they also, many of them ended up getting some new procurement contracts with government, and as restaurants are able to have a new relationship with government that they didn't have prior to the pandemic. So it's been really amazing. And the state ended up helping us connect with city workforce dollars for this, and then also get philanthropy to come in. So it was a true public partnership. And to me, it was I really want to thank Julie and Abby for that. And to me, it was a good example of how we might think about, or I know I've been thinking about, like working with the task force and working with the commission. Coming into the commission, I understand how we could actually get things done, to be very honest with you all, beyond just recommendations. And I'm still it's gotten even more confusing, of course, post-pandemic, but what became clear through the project of High Road Kitchens is that it seems like if we have some big picture ideas like Mary Kay's talking about, if some of us want to actually try them out or move them forward, there might be ways to kind of work together or partner with the state or with cities to make them happen. So the next step for me after High Road Kitchens and really thinking about expanding that is that we've been looking at, we were thinking about sectoral bargaining prior to the pandemic, some of us on the commission, Mary Kay and others. And then and thinking about how to make that happen in our sector, what we were thinking about a training cooperative to kind of bring workers together around food handler training. With the pandemic, as you all know, 25 to 30% of restaurants may be shuttering permanently, which means 25 to 30% of 1.7 million workers in California who might be long-term unemployed. And so we've been moving forward on basically food service and catering cooperative statewide with hundreds of thousands of workers, both for unemployed and underemployed workers. And similar to the High Road Kitchens, thinking about how we might, Abby's already been very helpful. Abby, I didn't even get to tell you, but SBA, SBDC is doing free business planning for us for the cooperative. And it's great. Like, we are moving forward. We've gotten some funding to hire somebody to lead the project. You're talking about a couple 100,000 unemployed and underemployed workers coming together in a food service and catering cooperative that could ultimately allow us to do sectoral bargaining. So anyway, there's something really exciting happening. And to me, the way it happens is maybe we can think about programs and projects we can move forward, even if it's not what the task force is doing. So that brings me back to the question, which is, I'd love to know more about what are the ideas around job creation, because we've got some to offer.
Great, thank you so much, Saru. Jennifer.
Yeah, real fast. So I get that the task force is short term and the commission is longer term, but the solutions that the task force is looking at clearly overlap with some of the things that we've been talking about, a lot of the things we've been talking about. The personnel seem to overlap, or at least organizations are overlapping. And in the spirit that a crisis is a terrible thing to waste, it seems like the task force has a really great opportunity to push through more quickly some of the bigger solutions, which we haven't, I don't think, satisfactorily, at least in my opinion, articulated. I think we've got to, or there has to be more moonshotty, big kind of ideas. But my question is, since the task force is fantastic and you've got so many people, why don't we just fold the commission into the task force? Or why don't we seed or allow them to do the work? Why, it seems like there's two groups and they're doing kind of the same thing. And why, because of the crisis, and you got great people on there. I don't feel at all like, I wouldn't feel offended at all if we gave our stuff to the task force and allowed them to use the crisis to push forward what we're recommending in a more robust way.
Great, thanks, Jennifer. We'll take that up as part of our action questions as we process everything. That makes sense, Julie, right?
To hold on responding? Yes, I like that idea a lot.
Yeah, great.
I'm just taking notes, yeah.
And Wade Rose is sitting in for our commission member, Lloyd Dean, but also Lloyd is serving on the task force. Wade?
Thanks, Mary Kay. Julie, very quickly, Lloyd's perspective, certainly my perspective, is that the work of the commission is even more important as a result of the impacts of the pandemic. I mean, it's clear from our perspective that we're just at the beginning of the economic impact due to COVID, because the real solution to dealing with that virus is the introduction and utilization of effective vaccines, and that's off for a while. That's not going to happen tomorrow. It's probably not going to happen by the end of the year, but it hopefully will happen by mid part of next year. So pressures on the economy are going to be with us for quite some time, and we're going to have to be thinking very clearly about how to manage the damage, and that damage certainly has a huge impact on how we work. And what we think has happened, we've kind of hit a tipping point on the future of work. Certainly from a healthcare perspective, telemedicine, the efficacy of telemedicine has been proven. There was a decades debate about whether it would work or not within healthcare. I think that debate is over. Technology has certainly indicated that work from home in many instances is effective and can be meaningful from an organization's, company's point of view. That's not necessarily true from the point of view of essential workers, and that's very clearly understood, but it does point to the issue of the digital divide as well, and how we have to grapple with that, because this movement, the evolution of technology is inexorable. And COVID has impacted that significantly. And just one example, a good friend of ours is the president of a company which owns a major newspaper in California. His feeling is that the pandemic has probably cut off about 10 years from the timing for getting rid of print media. So they are now they're now looking at eliminating print media in their company very soon, and they had been thinking it was at least a decade away. And that's just because they see a change in work patterns and utilization of digital media. So at the bottom line, especially from the point of view of the task force, which has enabled us to have a pretty broad view of the impact, societal impact of the pandemic. I think the nature of work has changed. And that change has been accelerated, and that means the commission's work has become more important as we get into a more granular understanding of what that impact is, which the task force can have a look at, but I think the commission can do a very good job of doing that. So our perspective, bottom line, task force is important and in some manner should continue.
Thank you, Wade. Betty, I'm going to go now. Betty, Roy, Mariana, Lance, Maria, Carla, Ash. Those are the boxes in my order, and I just want to I know because you don't know and what I'm seeing. So Betty, and then Roy.
Thanks, Mary Kay, and thanks to Julie for the update. You know, from my vantage point, I've been approached by a number of groups that have brought ideas to me to try to be of assistance to flesh out. And what I wasn't sure about was as they portrayed them to be really ideas initiated by task force discussions. I guess one surprised me, and then two, I was concerned about just kind of some of the enormity of some of the ideas that were coming to me. And I guess I want to align myself with John Marshall's comments. You know, with the urgency of what we're dealing with, I think oftentimes we try to run to look at, you know, what's the next new shiny object that we're going to create rather than looking at what we already have in place that could be helpful. And I really do want to echo just the existing laws that we have that we certainly need to be mindful of and even elevate awareness of during this time with respect to workers and worker safety and health. And then the other thing with respect, so I'll give you an example. I was approached about the development of a state public bank to help businesses that are not able to get traditional lending. And it's a huge endeavor. Governor signed a bill last year that allowed locals to develop public banks. Lots of hurdles, very expensive, but you know, with my controller hat on, it's something I can't support. But it was portrayed as something coming out of the task force. And I just want to understand kind of the formality of what proposals really are adopted and embraced and I guess approved by members of the task force for further development. But all to say, there are existing institutions that can be helpful. And so as those ideas come up, I'm happy to, for example, just talk about the role that community redevelopment banks played in filling in the gaps on the PPP program that fell way short for many to get federal assistance. So definitely want to be part of the conversation and be helpful, but I think there is maybe a little bit more transparency and kind of information coming out about what's really on the table for the task force would be helpful.
Great, thank you, Betty. Roy.
I have very little to add, I think, to what's already been said. I appreciate the update. I'll just underline a few things that I heard already. One is Governor Granholm's comment about, do we need a separate effort? I hear that because my feeling about where we were headed before the COVID, the COVID task force's work began was we actually weren't headed to any one particular clear place. That interim report is an omnibus on all possible areas we might look at. And so I guess my way of looking at it is with respect to the importance of our current laws, I strongly believe that COVID has reminded us of the truth that the status quo, existing laws and otherwise, is not working, period, end of story, full stop. And this commission can either be a clear voice with a single-minded story about how we can reverse that and create a system that does work. And if we can't get to that point, then I think we should fold it into the kind of more crisis-oriented response that the broader task force is doing. So that's my hope and aspiration for us, is that we can come up with a really clear story of how we can address this over the long term.
Thank you, Roy. Mariana.
Yeah. Great to see everybody. Agree with echo some of the comments. In some ways we're dealing with three different crises, the public health crisis, the economic crisis, the racial justice crisis. In some ways for our workforce, from one day to the next, it was devastating. 80% of domestic workers lost all sorts of income in the first week of the pandemic. And those who continued to work, in particular in home care, did so with no changes from the industry. It was like business as usual, no PPE, no new precautions, and in working with very vulnerable populations. So, but I do agree that in some ways the crisis actually, similar to Roy's comments and others, is like really there's like a huge opening, and I think it is time to sort of move very bold systemic sort of solutions and changes. I mean, for one, around the visibilizing of invisible workforces through kind of the recognition of essential workers, though I think that needs to get translated into actually raising standards for those workers and making sure that they're healthy and safe. So there's been a lot of appreciation, but we haven't seen kind of investment in the essential workers with like increased pay, ensuring they have safe working conditions. I do think that there's a bigger conversation around the safety net and benefits and where like folks have like totally fallen through the through the cracks and the gaps of the existing kind of safety net and care and guarantee, and the bigger needs around childcare and elder care are just going to get exacerbated. And so I think there is sort of openings in and opportunities to really put forward a like sort of a different kind of system in place. And I do have a similar questions around the task force in the commission, because in some ways I know this is longer term, but in certain ways, like this context of the pandemic and then the economic depression that's some has come and will come is sort of like, I think the context of even looking at the bold solutions that we were coming with. And in some ways the task force, it seems duplicative, because although the task force is immediate, what needs to happen is to sort of like address some of this, the bigger context and the social economic. So one question on the task force is whether there has been any analysis and data that would be helpful for us around what's the disruption in different industries in the economy that the pandemic has caused. Is there any projections around what of those are going to be permanent, right? Like I think to Sarah's comment, like how many restaurants are never going to open, et cetera. How are the industries going to shift? And what does that mean for job loss? Like which jobs are actually not coming back? And with that, I think there's a second point of the investment that has come either from the federal government and from the state, an analysis of like who is that actually reached? How is it exacerbating gender, racial inequity? Even in terms of recovery, like where are there sort of gaps of who's kind of fallen through the cracks around just getting like sort of immediate support, but also in thinking about what does that mean in terms of like longer term economic and safety net, plans to ensure that that's reaching sort of, everyone. Yeah, I think that's it.
Thank you, Mariana. Lance, Maria, Carla, Ash, just to give people the order. Lance.
Thank you very much, Mary Kay. I think I'm like other task force members commission members, that when the task force was established, that it was a bold move by the governor and an acknowledgement that the issues facing California are far larger than just our perception and perspectives on the future of work. And I know there is a pedigree that touches both entities, which I thought was fantastic. I think you all know the membership by now. Pamela Khan, who's been before this commission before, is serving on the task force, bringing one of a few manufacturing voices to the table. So I think that part of it's good. A certain sense of me early on, so this goes back immediately after the task force was established, was kind of a relief, a little wipe of the forehead that now there's this larger entity that's looking much more globally about a pandemic and then how we can get through that pandemic. I'll have to also admit that at the time I hoped that the pandemic would be 60 to 90 days. We'd be back, to some sense of previous activity, which I will not call normal. But alas, here we are 4.5 months into a pandemic. I am in my office right now for, I could probably count on both hands the number of times I've been in my office, which is right across the street from the Capitol in those 4.5 months. I haven't seen my staff other than 2 individuals in that same time, other than daily Zoom check-in meetings. So I bring that experience to the table to share mine. I'm sure it's not dissimilar from all of yours. And I want to underscore the fact we are in a pandemic. Thankfully, it affects all of us and all of the states fairly equally. But manufacturing in California is struggling. We're probably at 70% of capacity. And I've made the case to the governor directly and others that our economic base is so strong for California that, yeah, we wear that essential title quite proudly. It's not without its risks. And I know there's been a lot of discussion about PPE from my other commissioners. That's why we launched a Ppe Initiative with the administration that the governor launched a month ago to address that very fact. And it wasn't easy to get to that spot. You just don't flip a switch and PPE shows up at factories. We've had to have manufacturers change their operations to address the crisis. And I want to at least give a pat on the back to the manufacturing sector, because after all, restaurants need somebody to make something to make their environments more safe. And we've accepted that mantle, and we're carrying it forward. But what I want to do is make sure that the Future Work Commission does its role and that the task force can take our work in perhaps a much broader view than where we've been occupying ourselves over the last several months, because this is going to require a 360 review of not only work, but of employers, employees, how we work, where we work, and how we work together. And I know that's a familiar refrain that I've shared with you all before. So I do want to keep it brief. I intended to keep it briefer than that. I apologize, but keep on keeping on with the task force. I think it's the right group, maybe too large. It has been criticized recently. And I think a lot of that hinges around the transparency, and there are reasons why, I mean, just like us, we're maybe not as transparent as we need to be. So I think if those issues can be addressed, we're off to a really good future here in California. But underscore, we are in a pandemic. Nothing has changed without a vaccine or a treatment. And thankfully, Californians are being more receptive to the wearing of masks in public. And I'm happy about that, because I was very discouraged 30 to 45 days ago when I didn't see an uptick in the public health or concern, at least, about public health. So off the soapbox, sorry. Thanks, Mary Kay, for your indulgence, and fellow commissioners. But
we welcome the soapbox, Lance. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Maria.
Yes, thank you, Mary Kay, and it's nice to see everyone as well. I just wanted to say that I sit on the operational committee with Mary Kay, and so I thought your recap was just perfect. And Julie, thank you for providing that context as well. I think on my reflection, what I would like to add is very, very similar to a lot of the themes that have already been shared about, the work that this commission has done to date. I just see it really aligning with the goals and the vision set out for the task force. So I do think we need to figure out how do we bring them closer together, because the conversation's very similar. And I think it would be important for us with our future work commission hat on to ensure that we're sharing that view with the task force. I also think that one of the other things that would be important to share with this group are the governor's equity guidelines. And I don't know if we can grab those, but I thought the way that the task force began and how that was defined as sort of, starting principles on any ideas that would come up, I think it's really reflects sort of the heart of what the goal is here for this commission. I think that would be important to view. And then I do want to, support something that Betty made, her comment about we have existing laws and we have existing, departments that do work. And I do think it's important to bring that into the conversation as well. I think the ideas that I've seen bubble to the top when we're talking about the digital divide and how important that is, I could see that moving forward. But there are a variety of ideas that are out there that may maybe go contrary to what might be existing, or maybe there are task force members that don't fully know the various systems that are in place at the state level. So I think it's an important point, Betty, and I think it's something that again should be shared back with the task force. So with that, that's my comment. Thank you so much, Mary Kay, for giving me the opportunity to share a little bit.
Great. Carla.
It's great to be with everybody. Just a couple of thoughts. First, I just wanted to thank Julie and Abby and Londe, Anish, and the members of the commission that are on the task force. Thank you. It was a great summary today. So general thought is just obvious point. A lot of people are being let out of prison and jail right now because they're overcrowded and they're coming back into a situation of high unemployment. A lot of people are about to lose their housing and become homeless and are on the verge of that. And we know that's happening. And then we still have, lots of young people coming out of foster care, lots of young people not connected to school and work before the pandemic. And we have people with disabilities who are, I would just note, at the anniversary of the passage of the ADA, 60% of people with disabilities are unemployed. So we had a big problem with certain populations not even being really part of the workforce before, and we're going to have an even bigger problem now, and they're going to be in competition with everybody else who just lost their job.
Yeah.
So those situations are more important than ever. I've been trying to advocate since we started the task force for some bold idea. Now is the time for a bold idea, some sort of worker core linked to training can be done in this state now. We have the infrastructure to do it. We can do it. So that's just point one. And then just on the different topic, like what should we be doing and how does this work? I wanted to pick up on some of the themes because I heard 3 basic ideas and I just wanted to quickly say what I think those were or are. One is, I think Saru pointed out, great thought, and Lance also, practical ideas we can work on together. This is a powerful group. It's an interdisciplinary group. It includes the government and a lot of different agencies. If we have these practical ideas, can we surface them here before the meetings, plan for it? I know it has to be public meeting and work on them together in some way to at least take a first step. So that's one thought. At route number 2, I think I heard was kind of Jennifer and Betty together. The Hertzberg just put out a big call for, a giant investment program. The governor's looking at investment. There's budget issues, there's existing programs, there's practical, big things going on right now. There's advocacy for the federal dollars. Do we want to weigh in on that? Let's identify our priorities and push for them. I mean, is that a role? That would be number 2. And then the number 3 I heard from Mariana, which I thought was really interesting, is more our long-term, we're supposed to be setting the table for the long term. And I think I heard you say, Mariana, what jobs are not coming back, who has relief reached or not reached, how has inequity been exacerbated, and how do we amplify equity? Just kind of setting the table for the future of work in that way, kind of acknowledging the big changes that have just happened. I mean, I thought that was really, really compelling. So I don't know the answer to that, but it seems like we have a lot of different choices about, what we're going to do.
It's so helpful, Carla, that you crystallized it, because I've been texting with Julie thinking, okay, like how do we try and create some buckets here? So thank you. We'll come back to those buckets. Ash.
Hi, everybody. It's good to hear from everyone. I'm actually on my Bluetooth driving from Sacramento, San Jose, so I don't see you all, but it's great to hear everyone and all your perspectives. And it reminds me of the missing the commission meetings that I enjoyed so much, and so it's great to get everyone together. And I'm just gonna make some comments and probably stay silent the rest of the meeting only because I am driving back. But the COVID crisis, as I've said many times during it, is not creating inequities; it's exposing inequities that are long existing and long standing. And I think our commission work was pointing to all of that as well. And the data points to all of that as well. And it's certainly being exacerbated. So in terms of what the task force is doing, it's really highlighting a lot of what the commission work was exposing. And, I think that as we look to what needs to be done and we see the impact that this crisis is having on our essential workers, on those that are allowing so many of us to stay home, and the fact that we're about to see potentially millions of Californians at risk of eviction, and on and on and on. But we absolutely have to look at what big ideas and big solutions there might be out there. And the tinkering around the edges, I think now more than ever, is so clear. Is a path that's gonna lead to continued inequities and continued injustice. And so at the same time, we also know that, I'm trying to remember, but to kind of paraphrase Dr. King, that, that it's not just about it's about creating justice, which means that it's not just about the absence of tension. But what I mean by that, or at least the reason why I paraphrase that, is that solutions are going to be difficult, and they're going to, any solution that's meaningful and creates systemic change is going to need folks to move from where they are. And the reason why I mentioned that, I just did our labor committee hearing yesterday. We have a number of bills, many in response to COVID, regarding protecting our grocery workers and other essential workers, farm workers, our garment workers, and on and on. And pretty much, to the issue and to the bill, you had the workers' rights advocates and the unions and all that in favor, and then you had some of the corporate and business interests against. And that was pretty much in alignment what we oftentimes see. And the reality is that if we're going to uplift these workers, if we're going to uplift Californians, if we're going to show that we care about the disproportionate deaths and infections of Blacks and Latinos, that we got to figure out a way to move forward together. And that means it's going to cause some tension. And, we have to figure out morally where we are. Our social contract is absolutely broken, and COVID shows it. And are we going to be bold enough? And saying that on the 55th anniversary of Medicare and Medicaid, are we going to actually do something bold to actually create healthcare justice and economic justice for Californians? And, that's why I was excited about joining the commission. I still see the commission as having the opportunity to do that. But I think that if we don't, then I think we fail in our mission to really create the systemic change that we need to actually heal and bring about a moral social contract that doesn't leave so many people behind. So thank you all for, and I look forward to continuing to hear comments as I drive back home to San Jose. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much, Ash. Safe travels. We wish we could see your face, but we'll settle for your voice and thinking. I think I'm scrolling through. I believe I got every commissioner. We have some fabulous members from the governor's team and other senior staff with us, but I didn't miss anybody, did I? Mariana, did you want to say something? I saw your hand up.
No, I was just saying that I see Doug's hand go up.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Yes, Doug, Commissioner, you're next.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. I really appreciate everybody's comments. And I agree 100% that this pandemic has reaffirmed for me that we were right on the mark here in the Future Work Commission. Our analysis of the problem, the decline in worker power, the fissuring of work, how that's impacted people of color in particular, the need to enforce existing labor laws to retool the workforce development system. I think we were right about all of those things. But I'm curious about the task force, and I feel like there's a major area that we brushed upon here at the Future Work Commission that we need to go much deeper in. And I say this from personally spending the last 25 years helping workers join together to fight for a bigger piece of the pie, and wondering if the pie is not rotten now. And just speak from the example of my union, the Teamsters. So many of you have heard me talk about our largest employer, UPS. It's the largest collective bargaining agreement in the country. When we started the pandemic, we had 275,000 members there. We now have 325,000. That's because there's been a 40% increase in volume from Amazon, because this thing has accelerated the trend towards online shopping. And right now, we're having a panel. We have over 10,000 grievances against UPS, mostly for overtime, because our members are working around the clock. And we've had some outbreaks at UPS. We've had outbreaks in other places. But really, what I want to talk about is Amazon. And I don't know if people saw in the news that the CEO made $13 billion in one day. It's the most anybody has ever made in one day. This from a company that cut hazard pay for workers last month in Amazon warehouses, and where there have been huge outbreaks, and it's mostly workers of color. I bring this up just to say that I don't think anybody on this commission would agree or disagree when I say what's wrong with that picture, you know. And I feel like we lightly brushed on the commission on issues around the accumulation of capital, around a deeper analysis of our economic system. We talked a little bit about antitrust. We talked a little bit about a system where corporate profits get reinvested into shareholder buybacks. And there are people on this commission that are much more knowledgeable about this stuff than I am. But I think we need to go deeper on this stuff, because I think it intersects with questions about how we fund public services in this country, how we pay for infrastructure, how the social safety net is structured, which folks talked about here, whether the delivery of benefits and social safety things should be tied to employment. And those are, in my opinion, longer term and deeper questions than I see the task force, the Governor's Economic Recovery Task Force, dealing with. And I feel like our commission is uniquely poised to dig deeper on these very important questions. So I would urge us to look at those and continue the important work that we started here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Doug. I'm sorry I was not scrolling properly. I'm glad to get your voice in. I want to welcome our co-chair, James Manika. James, we've had a really rich discussion based on Julie's outline of the task force, and I disrupted then me, Maria, and Wade all expanding on the task force because it felt like Julie gave enough meat. And mostly what commissioners have reacted to is what they thought possible for the commission to do going forward, or a reflection about their engagement with the task force, because many people on the commission have other parts of their organizations serving on the task force. John Marshall has a UFCW local leader from Southern California that he's been supporting on the task force. Peter has a CEO from Salesforce on the task force. So there's a lot more intersections than the four of us that have been on both. And what has surfaced is a set of questions about how does the future of work's original problem statement and initial thinking on recommendations get infused in the task force? Do we fold into the task force work? Should the commission tune up the problem statement given the tectonic shifts that have occurred because of the public health and economic crisis, where new work is being created overnight and old jobs aren't returning because of the tectonic shift? And that was Mariana's offering that Carla reinforced, that maybe the commission should take a breath and kind of retool our thinking about the problems and solutions based on the shifts. And then there's total unity that I heard that every one of us wants to actually make change. And let's make change through the task force, or let's make change through the commission, whichever way we want to do it. And so Julie, I think you were going to try and crystallize the questions as you and I were texting back and forth.
No,
and then
I feel like You already, Mary Kay, did that.
Oh,
So
okay.
I mean, I think what I'm going to say is a little bit of a repeat, but let me just say it back also and then look for reactions, right, to see if we're capturing, because everybody had such excellent comments that I don't think that there's a way to distill them into just a few, but in terms of trying to move us to the next phase in this conversation. And of course, James, we want to hear from you on, and since you're leading this next part of the discussion, maybe we can have you share your comments as we transition to that. But I think, as Mary Kay already said, right, there's still the remaining question is, what is this commission's space or charge, right? You know, what do we need to do, want to do? You know, what was the original charge? What remains of that between now and, let's just say, the end of the year, right? Which is when we had set for us delivering a report. Related to that is the question of, does it make sense to continue our work separate from the task force? And I feel like we heard some varying opinions about that. Not everybody weighed in on that, but I really agree with what Mary Kay is saying, that it sounds like people want to, you know, we know there's a tremendous work to do. There isn't one body that's going to be able to cover all of it. And so, you know, what does it look like for us? And then another piece of it is, I think we just had a question, you know, there's a sort of an ongoing tension, right, about how much information and data this body needs to do our work versus how much we want to spend our time together just rolling up our sleeves, digging in, coming up with ideas and actually doing it. I mean, you know, in an ideal world of unlimited time and resources, we would do both, right? It's hard to come up with ideas without a deep grounding in information and data, but we did spend the first several months of our time trying to walk that line. And as we were, you know, at the phase of the Commission's work when the pandemic hit, we were at a point where we weren't trying to gather a lot more information, but really trying to dig deep on what our recommendations were going to be. So I think there's the question of whether there's an appetite for more information, especially given the changes that COVID have wrought on the economy versus, you know, spending the truly really limited time we have left between now and December on honing in on, you know, doubling down on a lot of our ideas. I really appreciated the point that many people made, starting with Betty, that, you know, there's a lot of resources and things that are there. I would say that's true about the Commission's work as well. So we're not talking about, I think, revamping everything we've ever done, right? But you know, is there an appetite for grounding ourselves in new data, or do we want to focus, you know, continue the trajectory we were on in the life of the Commission of just really finalizing our ideas and recommendations? And the last piece is really to lift up what Doug just said, which is, are there pieces, big pieces that we feel are still missing from what we've done, right? Is anything that's not at the task force and not here yet that we haven't done enough of? And, you know, is there time even or space for to lift up some of those things? So I'm so sorry if I didn't capture. I think there was so many rich things that were said. I will say one thing about, I think it was maybe Saru and maybe Carla who mentioned, you know, I think there's just one of the beautiful things about this Commission, I think, is the relationships that have been developed to allow us to do work even outside of, you know, it's work that aligns with things we're all doing anyway. So I want to say, you know, that I feel really excited about and committed to continuing those paths. And I think we will, you know, continue to find ways for us all to do that. I think that's also related to Betty's point, Ash's point, right, about the things, Lance's point, about things that we're all doing in the worlds that we're in, and making sure that even if they're not like kind of the big recommendations of this Commission, that there's concrete work that we need to be doing in this time. We are the ones to do it, and we want to make sure that we carry that forward too, whether or not they're formally part of the Commission's task. So James, I'm looking at you, so glad you're here.
Well, thank you, Julie, and it's wonderful to see everybody's faces again. This has been an extraordinary time, and it's been wonderful also to keep in touch with many of you, whether it's through the work of the task force and other things that we've connected with and done together in this kind of intervening months. I guess, Julie, to answer your questions a bit, and maybe to give some of my own reflections, which, you know, I think I caught some of yours, but I didn't hear everybody because I joined late. I would kind of make, I guess, five observations. The first is, I think, in many respects, you know, COVID has exposed, you know, if we thought there were challenges for work and workers in California, COVID has exposed that, I don't know, multiple times over, and perhaps might even have exposed other things that we probably hadn't fully appreciated at the time when we did the bulk of our work. So that, to me, that's why I think the comments about potentially tuning up our problem statement, or I think Mariana and maybe Doug alluded to that. I think, to me, it feels warranted because we now know so much more. Not to say that things we observed before were wrong. I think they were correct. It's just that they're much bigger, and there may be some other pieces we hadn't fully contemplated. So that's one observation. The other observation that I would make is I think if, I think many of you said this, and I remember in particular, the Governor Jennifer and Roy and others in our earlier work that we needed to be bold. And I think if COVID has shown us anything, is that in fact we can and should be bold because many of these things are probably being reset and rewritten. And if ever there was a moment to really be bold, I remember our conversations about moonshots, or not in the 10-year time frame, but as in the next few years, but thinking about really bigger, bolder ideas, to me has become much, much more apparent. So one of my reflections is, why can't we be bold in this moment as so many things are being reset? So that's the second observation. And then I guess the third observation that I would make is that I think as we think about work and workers, which everybody here cares passionately about and is doing and is working on both in their day jobs and outside of that and everything else we all do, I think we actually here have two vehicles for impact. And I think we should use both of them. We've got the task force and we've got this commission. I think the task force, it's been wonderful to see both people who are involved directly and indirectly how many of our ideas that came out of our task force, of our commission, have actually fed into the task force. I've had the privilege, along with Mary Kay, and others, and some of you being on the task force, but also Mary Kay and I happen to be on the operating committee for the task force. And it's been wonderful to see many of the ideas that came out of this commission take life and flight in recommendations that have come up in many of the subcommittees of the task force and have ended up on the operating committee. Mary Kay herself has brought a bunch of ideas, others that, Mary Kay and I would look at them and say, oh, we recognize those. Even ideas about equity, about justice, that, now infuse the task force came out of this. So all of that to say, I think we've got two vehicles for impact here for work and workers. One is the task force and the other is the commission. And I would encourage us to say, as much as we can infuse into the task force, we can and we should, partly because it's here and it's now and already involves many participants and many companies, many of whom are employers and many organizations that represent workers. So it's a great crucible for infusing action. But I think these two vehicles are different. I think the task force is much more in the moment of this moment and is very much looking at very immediate tactical operational things right now. Whereas I think our commission has the possibility of looking at bigger structural, longer term things. So I think these vehicles could serve different purposes. And I think many of the ideas that we came up with can end up in one or the other. So my own reflection is, I think, I wouldn't encourage folding this commission into the task force, but I would certainly encourage us to think about what can we implement through the task force, but what are the things that this commission can look at? Maybe it's the bigger things, maybe it's the more structural things, the kinds of things that Doug was alluding to when I caught the tail end of his comments. Maybe those are the bigger things that the commission in its own capacity should still focus on. So that's my view, at least on these two vehicles, and the distinction, which is my fourth point, that I think there is a distinction between them about what each of them can be useful for. I guess my final comment, and I'll stop, is just the fifth comment is just about the practicalities of all of this. I think we do have a time commitment where we have a deadline. I think Julie and Landia will remind us, which is the end of the year. I don't know what the exact date is, where this commission should report back a final report. And so I think we should think about what goes into that. Is it a tune-up of the problem statements and issues we identified? Is it an update, dramatic update to the recommendations? Is it pulling out some subset of those recommendations where we can be bolder than we were already to rise to the challenge? I think that Jennifer and others and Roy and others and many of you encourage us to be bold. Is it that? Or is it something else along the lines of the kind of the, piloting or testing the initiatives that we were talking about before? So I think the question of what's in our final deliverable, to me, is a big question that it would be wonderful for us to think about collectively as a practical matter. And then also there's a practical matter of how we do our work. We're still in this remote environment. We still can't get together. How do we do that? How do we get the benefit of involving others and other ideas, particularly as we try to think bolder? And what's our collective capacity, individual and collective capacity? Because, all of you and many of you are doing very, very important work for workers right now, and there's enormous demands on your time, our time collectively. So there's a practical question about just our collective capacity and how we do our work. So those are things that at least I would be keen to hear some reflections from all of you about. It's kind of as the final kind of practical consideration set of points. I don't know if that's helpful, Julie, but those at least are my own reflections.
Well, that's extremely helpful as always. So let me just get a sense of the virtual room. I think what we were going to do is move into a discussion, and I think we've already kind of naturally flowed to that, around what is the work of the commission itself. I think all these questions really do raise that. And I think James put forth some very powerful, sort of statement about what the coexisting roles of the commission and the task force could be. Do people have reflections or thoughts on that particular point?
Yeah, I just wanted to offer a story for it, but I also saw Peter's hand, Julie. I just wanted to take what James said conceptually and bring it to life with one proposal that I'm working through the task force that I was hoping could be amplified along the lines that Doug talked about, which is how do we drive structural change for the California communities that have always been excluded. And as Sararu said at the beginning, create pathways out of that structural block. So I don't know if that's useful to people, but I could hold it for the later conversation.
Please share, Mary Kay. How's that you're working on?
So I went into the task force thinking, because James and I did a briefing of Anne, and Anne had heard about it, Tom Steyer with Julie, on our problem statement. And going through that exercise made me think, I got to hold number 1, end worker poverty, and number 7, restore workers' power and organization as my mission on this task force. And James was holding other things about the transition of work in the way that Lance spoke about, like thinking about the shifts in remote and telemedicine. And so we thought of ourselves as your agents in trying to inject not just the problem of the pandemic and not just the problem of the 2 million that became unemployed in March and April, but the 7 million that have always been blocked out is the way and then the equity principles fueled it. So we created 2 ideas. One was, could we create a training program of our janitors that were laid off from commercial office buildings, because all the downtown office buildings were emptied out in the pandemic in April. Of our 30,000 janitors whose total comp is $66,000 a year, just to give you a sense of that job is very different than most cleaning jobs in the state. 10,000 of them lost their livelihood because of the shrink. We learned, because cleaning contractors moved these very high-powered disinfectants into their buildings without any training or orientation, that most workers were getting asthma attacks and these really bad rashes because there was no orientation to using this hospital grade disinfectant because of it was the freak out moment that I don't know how many of you experienced, but I certainly was in the panic freak out moment, and it landed hard on essential workers, as people know. So this Cleaning Contractors and Building Skills Partnership created a disinfecting cleaning certification for our commercial office cleaners, and Julie and I just graduated 192 of them. That work made us think, as I listened to CEOs on the task force, hey, this is a big problem that everybody needs to get tuned up on how to clean public and private spaces to like stem the spread of the virus. So we tried to begin to imagine, could we pilot hiring 10,000 janitors on top of the other 10,000 that were being called back to work that could get access to union training, union wages and benefits. So there's no debate about healthcare and paid sick leave, which there is a debate about still, which enrages me in this moment for millions. And personal protective equipment and all the health and safety things that frankly, John's union, UFCW, led on in this state for grocery workers. You know, and there was a big breakthrough very early on the state playing a role in setting a health and safety standard for workers in all retail grocery stores, thanks to the union bargaining it with the union grocers. So I thought about that and the governor's willingness to take executive action on that, and tried to figure out how could we meet the needs of the private sector employers, create a path out of poverty, and advantage the formerly incarcerated and undocumented. Because of Carla being on this commission with me, we wrote that into the proposal, which requires a different kind of recruitment, if you're willing to do, and political will on the part of the union and employer to advantage those, you know, create a pathway. And so we're trying to figure out if we can create a pilot in the Silicon Valley, thanks to, frankly, Google's leadership. Google is interested in trying to figure out if they can lever their headquarters building to expand the use of union certified infectious disease cleaners. And then we have 2 employers in LA that aren't ready to be named yet that want to consider doing it. And it goes to John's point earlier about role of government. All these employers are saying to us, hey, if this is a standard across the state, we'd be way more interested in doing this permanently, because we don't want to be disadvantaged if we're the only ones, if there's just a handful of us doing it. And so Cal OSHA is now trying to figure out, can we create a sort of incentive by creating certification on cleaning? And the governor's team's trying to figure out, do we legislate or EO, because of this dynamic we're having about the hot spots rising in Southern California. We're trying to think about how to get to scale, is the way I can talk about it. So my thought on this in relationship to us was, how do we think about cleaning, not just as what SEIU has been able to bargain in commercial real estate downtown centers, or what UFCW's done in retail grocer and meatpacking, or what Teamsters have done in their various facilities, because everybody has cleaners. But could we imagine the 500,000 cleaners that don't have any chance of being in a union under current labor law, who clean small businesses, homes, Airbnbs? Could they have access to organization and quality jobs that have wages and benefits? Would be like, if we could make the breakthrough in the task force in commercial real estate, could the commission imagine going to scale in our future? And what is the impact of technology on this work in the future, which frankly we can't think about right now because we're responding to an emergency and we're going very fast. And it made me wonder if the proposal that is still incubating and we're trying to land it, and we hope to have something by the end of August, but how do we use the task force interest in the way Jennifer was encouraging us? And then the commission's sensibility that it's not just about the emergency, but we want to have permanent structural change in the, and there's a similar story that we're working on that I don't want to take your time on for nursing home workers who are under the gun. 50% of the deaths in the state have occurred in nursing homes, workers and residents. How do we intervene on that emergency, but also connect their work to the home care work that Mariana talked about and help people move into home and community-based settings and out of skilled nursing facilities for the permanent care of our elders and people with disabilities without losing union wages and benefits and raising union wages and benefits in a sector that's always been excluded. That's the way I think, that's how I've been thinking about in concrete terms, like how to make the practical breakthrough that Saru and Carla spoke about and connect it to the more conceptual long-term intervention that Doug spoke to. So I don't know if that's helpful, Julie and James, but I just wanted to ground it because I have to admit to you all, I was like Saru in trying to figure out originally what could be done in the task force that would accelerate what I learned from all of you in this commission. And then what could the commission, I actually think the commission has to leapfrog into the new reality that was created by the pandemic. I think about Stefan. I don't know if people remember Stefan like pounding on us all saying, only 5% of the people work at home, 30% of the American workforce could work from home. We just have to set up the expectation. And that's now going to be a permanent feature of the American workforce, it seems. So anyway, it makes me think about Stockton differently. It makes all the stuff that we did before in this environment you would want to escalate on, it seems.
Yeah, and I think in many ways, Mary Kay, and then we'll take a few questions. I know Peter and a few others seem to want to jump in, but I think what you just described is a great illustration of ideas that came out of the commission, finding life and animation with a set of entities in California who are already on the commission, whether it's the Googles or the other participants, et cetera. But I think that's a great example of using the task force to bring to life things that might have taken our commission. Remember, we were all talking before about let's go find employers, let's go find collaborative partners to try this, that, and the other. Well, in some ways, the task force has assembled them for us. And so to a large extent, if we can capitalize on them because they've already expressed an interest by being on the task force, why not take advantage of that? So that's a great example. But let's hear other comments and reactions. I know, Peter, you had your hand up earlier.
Well, I wanted to say something very brief, that I strongly support your comments, James, and in line with Mary Kay. I don't need to say more than that, but I think that's the right direction.
Okay, terrific. I can see any other hands. So my screen is acting up here, so I'm not quite sure. So if I don't see you and you've got your hand up, please just jump in.
Yes.
Oh, hey,
This is
Carla.
Wade.
Please go ahead, Carla.
Go ahead, Wade.
Hey, Carla had her hand up. Sorry, I'm sorry, Wade. But go ahead, Carla.
Okay, I just, listen, that was a very inspiring, Mary Kay. Thank you for the great story. And I guess my thought would just be on a practical level, I would certainly favor sharpening our problem statement, sharpening our recommendations. But then what I really like about the various comments today, again, the examples we've had, Lance, Saru, Mary Kay, it seems like what the idea was for this group, coming forward with our recommendations, was that we're saying we're not just pointing a finger at somebody and telling them to do something and that way things will happen. We're saying we need to make things happen. We need to make things happen. That seems to have been the spirit of it. So I guess I just would advocate for, again, this possibility. Perhaps people in this group could surface prior to the next time we get together practical, big initiatives we're working on, and maybe even think about some ways that others here could be helpful. And then maybe we can set some priorities, or I'm not quite sure that process, but set some priority, and then actually participate in some way with one another to advance some of these ideas and make them real. And those, it seems to me, could happen on parallel tracks. Obviously, doing the practical work could inform the recommendations, but I think they'd probably have to happen on parallel tracks. And then maybe you've set some tracks that can continue past the time of the recommendations, that then we're working on actual projects together. And there's been a lot of inspiring ones mentioned today.
Yeah, no, thank you for that, Carla. I see Mariana giving that a thumbs up, I think. But were you putting up your hand, Mariana, if I misunderstood your signal there? Okay, Wade, I think you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, just quickly, I think one way to effectively look at the situation we're in is that we are experiencing natural disaster on a worldwide scale that's never been experienced before. And its implications are going to expand from between now and the time of an effective vaccine or vaccines are implemented and distributed. But what it has done has created permanent change in social structures for a multitude of reasons. And what we are looking at now is the beginning of significant permanent change, especially in American society, but arguably worldwide. And so we do have to grapple with dealing with this. It's no longer theoretical in the sense that we come up with elegant ideas about how to address chronic problems in equitable distribution of income or in the structure of work. But we really need to think about this as super big permanent problem, which is only going to grow until we can tamp it down, tamp the pandemic and the virus down. And then what we're going to be left with is the reverberations of the impact of this natural disaster, which is going to require us to change how we do things. So the Commission needs to continue its work because it can deal with the issue of the change in the nature of work much more than the task force can, but obviously they're interrelated and both need to continue.
Wade, if I could press you a second, if I could, to follow up on that a bit. So as you make those observations, which make sense to me and actually quite resonate with me, what does that cause you to want to do? Is it to upgrade our problem statement and recommendations? Is it to pull out a few and make them bigger? Is it, where does that take you, I guess, is the question.
James, I'd say upgrade and focus. Obviously, there's a universe of issues that we can't tackle because it's too complex, it's too big. So we need to focus, make choices about which are the ones that we feel will have the most significant impact, a meaningful impact, to addressing the issues we face, which have to do with equitable distribution of wealth, adequate income, and paying attention to how work is going to change. I mean, it's very clear to us from the healthcare perspective that the pandemic has caused us to move much more quickly into a world of digital communications than we had been anticipating. It's moved the timeline forward at least a decade. And things are going to be different. So we need to tackle that. And when we tackle that, we need to understand what that means for society as a whole and work, and work as a whole. But can't be the whole range of stuff, has to be the critical stuff.
Thank you. Would welcome, John, you've got your hand up. By the way, it would be wonderful to hear from other commissioners as you reflect on all of this before we get into planning what we do next. But John, you had your hand up. Please go ahead.
Yes, thank you, James. I want to make a quick comment I think is consistent with what I've been hearing. I think sharpening up the problem statement in light of where we are today is always a good idea, particularly given the enormity of the crisis we're facing. At the same time, I think it's really, I can't remember who made the comment previously, maybe it was you, James, that the task force can do these sort of immediate actionable items right now, but there's still a need for longer term sort of over the horizon planning. And I think that's where we play a critical role. And the two are obviously interrelated. And I'd like to just share, picking up on Mary Kay's story. The UFCW was able to sit down with the governor's office and really create this really important expansion of paid sick leave throughout the food chain. And that was a wonderful example of the way we could do that after having negotiated that with our union employers and then expand it throughout a sector. The challenge, and I'll be frank, is outside of the unionized sector, actually having that be implemented in non-union workplaces is a whole other story, right? And I see people nodding their heads. I know nobody's shocked by that. So the reality is we need to have the ability to regulate the private sector. We need to ensure that the laws we have on the books and all of these wonderful new ideas that we're proposing now, Mary Kay, it would be tragic if you were able to do what you're describing for cleaners and then have it exist in theory, but not in reality in those workplaces. We need to have the ability to have a government that is adequately resourced and empowered to make sure that all of these wonderful ideas are really brought to the fore. And I know resources are a big question. As somebody pointed out, we have 154 billionaires in the state of California who have seen their wealth increase by over $170 billion just in the 100 days after the COVID-19 crisis broke. The resources are here. We can do this, and that's the kind of boldness that I really hope we can embrace.
Thank you, John. Again, we'd love to invite other commissioners who haven't had a chance to reflect and comment.
I'm just wondering, as always, about practical next steps. We have 2 minutes left that was scheduled. I'm just wondering, is there a plan to have more meetings? What's the plan?
I think that's a perfect segue. We are about to jump into that. So I just want to give, if any other commissioners had a few things that they wanted to say before we jump to that. But that is exactly where we're going next. So maybe we go there right now. I don't see any hands up. And I don't know if Anmol, you're able to put up we have a simple page, this page. So, and again here, welcome everybody's input. But, Mary Kay and I and Secretary Sue and others, we were just reflecting on what could the plan look like? And we had a couple of thoughts on our objectives, and we can think about how we incorporate the comments you all have made to this as needed. But one was to do this effective reflection and tune-up, if you like, was number one, which is if we reflect back on our problem statement, which was our kind of articulation of the evolving challenges facing California's workers, how would we tune that up in light of what we've now learned? Is it that we, emphasize some of those things? Is it that we add a couple of things that we hadn't fully contemplated? But that's what, and does that change our view about the nature of, how we articulate the problems? That was one objective that and I think some of you have highlighted similar sentiments with this idea of a tune-up. of how we articulate the challenges and problems facing California's workers. That's number one. The second, I think, is this idea, and I think several of you have said this, of focusing. I think Wade just said it, but the idea of picking a few places amongst our recommendations. If you all remember, we had, I think, about a dozen recommendation areas. I think we'd organize them into the ABCDs, but we had a kind of a way to think about that. But the question is, are there some of those where we would say these are really, really important, and on reflection now, with everything we've now learned, we think they're really important. And so this is where we really would like to be bold and actually have a bolder ambition as to what we think our recommendations could be, whether they are rise to the level of things that could become, I don't know, signature initiatives for the state, either the governor or, the state in collaboration with the private sector or other organizations. But are there kind of 4 or 5 areas of that kind? Now, we can think about what that means, whether that means these are then, a few commissioners who are passionate about those and help drive or, organize us to think about how to develop more ambitious concrete proposals around those areas. But it starts with this idea of identifying a few areas of recommendations that we think we need to be big and bold. And then, of course, the third item here is to think about, we still do need to, we are still required and should present a final report by the year end. So all of this, whatever we do with all of this, is still going to need to come into the form of a final report that we present to the governor and to the state and to the state by the end of the year. So these are some thoughts that we had, and I think some of your comments have certainly reinforced, I think, elements of number 1 and number 2 here, but maybe, we can add some other things to it. Let me say a couple of things about what that might mean for our timeline, but I'd like to come back and get some reactions from all of you about the objectives of this next round. But I think the timeline here, we could think about, doing a couple, kind of 3 more convenings before the year end. If we think about the kind of the cadence and the time frames, how we've worked on these things. So we could imagine one kind of in the late August, somewhere in the August, a couple in the August-October timeframe, and then another one which is to finalize everything in the October-November timeframe so that we're ready to actually produce and all of that, our final report by December. But we can come back to the timeline, but I want to just get some reactions and reflections on what our objectives could be for the remainder of this commission. So I don't know if Mary Kay, you want to add to that if I left anything out?
No, I think you captured it beautifully, James. Thank you.
Says Peter, once again, James, I like your plan. I'm happy to play along with this model.
Thanks, Peter. Carla, I saw your hand up.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I like this. I think I have 2 comments. Just one, on the prioritizing of the recommendation areas, I'd be interested in how are we going to do that? Because I'm not sure. I feel like we got to a certain point, but I think we could improve our process in advance of these meetings and during these meetings for being, greater clarity so that we're ready for that discussion and know what we're doing and make some good decisions on this. So I think that's critical, but I think the process for doing it could use a little tightening up and give us a little advance so that we can be ready for that. And then I did hear, and I just would like to add here, I think a different step that at least I'm hearing some interest in is, even if we have recommendation areas and we have proposals, we might also have practical areas that together we want to start moving. So could there be some room to put some practical ideas on the table where collaboration among members of this group might really help advance them in alignment with those recommendation areas for practical things we could do? So those would be my 2 comments. Thank you.
Thanks, Carla. I have some thoughts on that, but let's get some of the other comments from other commissioners.
This is Soraya, and picking up on some of the comments that have been made earlier, are we going to have permanent changes in which sectors? Because I think understanding and embedding some of our recommendations in the context of what those changes might be, I think would be beneficial. In some ways, the discussion has been very helpful because I've seen the task force, I think as you've mentioned, more kind of immediate as we're trying to get through this pandemic. But then on the other side of the pandemic, I think the work of the commission is going to be more needed than ever. When we look at various sectors, the location of work is going to change, the mode of work will change, the skills needed is going to change, building capacity and training that's going to be different. And then how do we put all of those changes within an equity-minded framework? And so I'm excited about some of the examples that's been given, but I do think we ought to figure out how do we take where we see these changes going and providing implications of what California needs to do to keep equity-mindedness at the forefront.
Thank you, Soraya.
Can I jump in and say something? I don't know, James, if you're able to speak.
Please, Roy.
So I'm also, prepared to go along with this process, of narrowing to a few areas. That said, I fear that if we just follow this process, we won't end up in the right place. And so I just want to make an invitation, which is this looks to me like a plan to come up with a plan yet again. We sort of have like, okay, let's come up. So maybe what's material here is 4 to 5 areas. I mean, just at the risk of being too direct about it, James and Mary Kay, for you guys as the chairs of this group, I, as a commission member, invite you to say, here's what we think are the top 1 or 2 areas, and I would welcome you being more forceful as authors of this report. As much as we all need to give input, I feel like we're not really reacting to something provocative, we're reacting to a process, and I don't know where it can come from other than the 2 of you being authors. And I mean, I'm happy to share what my priorities are, but ultimately, I think there needs to be some forceful, proposal-led leadership for us to get to a bold place.
Thank you, Roy. Direct as always.
James, it's Betty.
Please go ahead, Betty.
Thank you. I guess I feel very enthusiastic and hopeful about some of the work that's been done since we've last convened. Certainly the initiative that Saru was describing with respect to high-road kitchens, the work that Mary Kay has been deeply involved with respect to our care workers and nursing homes and in other venues. And I guess what I want to do is see whether how we can prevent those from being one-offs. And really having them, I guess really putting them up against kind of our set of recommendations and see whether that's a launching off point to scale up, whether it's within those sectors, whether it's across sectors, and then the piece that I really think, and I'm gonna probably keep hammering on this, but and looking to where we can use kind of our existing, regulatory framework, existing institutions that can be helpful with respect to what we can do to protect workers during this time. I don't think we've fully kind of harnessed all of that yet. And I just, again, feel like I'm just somebody who just always believes that before we kind of go to that next new thing, that we ought to utilize every tool that we have in our toolkit. So that's where I'd like to kind of start. The timeline looks fine to me, and I just am ready to get to work.
Thank you. Any other comments? And I'll try to respond to some of the comments and then also invite Mary Kay to do the same. But before we do that, go ahead, please, Doug.
Thank you. I'm using the raise hand feature here in Zoom, but I'm not sure if we're using that here or not. I'm fine with this plan here. I just have a question when I look at the proposal on convenings 9 and 10 and how we're going to deal with objective number 1 here, because as I was listening to us go around during the earlier part of this meeting, it's really had me think about a question that I've been struggling with ever since the pandemic hit as it relates to this commission, which is, were we planning for a future of work and a future for workers that looks a lot different than the present now? And does that future even exist? Possibly. So my question is, how do we answer that question? At what point do we deal with objective number 1 to try to answer that question? I hope that's clear.
Yeah, the question is certainly to me, Doug. Maybe I can take a crack at giving some reactions to some of the questions, and Mary Kay, I invite you to do the same. I think that, and I'm going to take them in different orders because I think they might flow better in different order to how the questions came in. I think, both Soraya and Doug, you raise an important question related to item number 1 here, because I think, Soraya, what you're asking is, do we have a view on the sectoral impacts that have happened and will happen as a result of this? And Doug, you're asking, do we fully understand, or how could we fully understand the implications, and to what extent do they change and how much our view that we had before on what the challenges actually were? And I think that's an important set of questions. And I think one of the things we're going to need to think through is, if in fact we're going to spend some time in one of the convenings, what are the inputs, whether it's research or insights or analysis, whatever the case it is, that gives us some view into number 1? I think that's going to be important. So we're going to need to think about, where do we get those inputs? Is it research? Is it work people are doing? Is it your own experiences? Is it, perspectives from different organizations, et cetera, et cetera? But I think that defines the work to be done. We have to do that work. Otherwise, I don't see how we get number 1 done. And number 1 in my mind is then what allows us to tune up, hopefully it won't be whole scale tuning up, but tune up how we define the problem statement from before. So I don't know if that addresses your question, Doug and Soraya, but I think we're going to need to think collectively about how we do that work. But I think that's a very important question. I think with regard to, I think the question, I think about how do we get to the 4 or 5 areas, there's various ways we can do that. And I think we should use all 3 that I'm about to suggest. If you recall, when we did the work before COVID, amongst our recommendation areas, we'd always tagged a few of them as candidates for moonshots. So I think it's worth going back to some of those, because I think the reason for even though we never quite defined what the moonshot goal was, but we'd always recognize that these were really big, important areas that needed something quite dramatic. That was going to be a big goal. So that could be one input on how we think about our 4 or 5 areas. Now, we could have changed our minds now about those areas we tagged that way in light of what everything that's happened, but that's one input. I think another input, quite frankly, is I think all of you, because I would be quite interested as you think about our list with fresh eyes, or at least with, COVID eyes, if I could call them that, are there some of those areas where now you say, these look really, really important? I think I would encourage you to highlight those. And in fact, the sooner you can do that, the better. So that when we get together, we're not starting from scratch with, what do we think are the 4 or 5 areas, but you fed into us and our team what those are. And then the third input is, I'm sure Mary Kay has some views. I have some, and it is my views, for what it's worth, to have the benefit of, being on the task force and seeing the COVID impacts on California directly through that lens, statewide at least, and also some of the research I do. So I have some ideas too, but I'm a commissioner like all of you, and I certainly will put my thoughts into the mix as to what I think those 4 or 5 areas are. But I think we should utilize all of those inputs, but do it quickly so that we're not spending the time when we get together next trying to figure out what they are. I would hope that by the time we get together again, we have a starting list, we have a starting point, having had all those inputs. So that's my thoughts on that. I think, to the point that, Carl, I think you raised about, what are some of the practical things we should do? I think it relates also to, Betty, your point about scaling up the things so that they don't become one-offs. I think there we really should think about what our practical scaling mechanisms are. I continue to think that the task force is actually one of those, by the way, because that's actually one of the ways Mary Kay, quite frankly, and others are scaling up some of those ideas that have come up. But there may be others. So and then there are also going to be things that some of you want to take on as commissioners. So I think of all of those as kind of practical scaling, practical go-do things for us to do. And many of you were already pretty excited before when we were together last time about things that you wanted to go make happen in the real world. I think we should still think of that. I just think now we have an added vehicle for that, which is the task force. So let's also use it. So I don't know if Mary Kay, you have some other reactions and reflections on the question.
Just a question about how to sharpen what I agree with your inputs, the candidates for the moonshot, highlight areas for action. And I'm just wondering if once we gather all of that from the commissioners, James, I actually liked Roy's suggestion of you and I then, instead of just presenting a list back, that the group would prioritize, you and I take a shot at making a proposal back to the commissioners about the priorities based on all those inputs and based on the COVID-I analysis that presumably we've gathered, we have outside information, and we just stake a position that allows us to be from number 1 to number 2 with a proposal. Is that what you were intending when you summarized?
It was, Mary Kay, but I was just trying to encourage that if you and I are going to do that, we have the benefit of the inputs.
Everybody's thinking
what commissioners think.
Yes.
We'll certainly put our judgment on it, Mary Kay.
Got
but
it.
At least I'd like to have the benefit of what people think as well.
Got it. So number 2, based on discussion, would get rewritten as co-chairs make a proposal on the 4 to 5 priorities, and then the commissioners have a discussion and agree or change, and then we break into 2 commissioners developing ambitious concrete proposals based on each of the priorities. It's just a little sharpening step that I hear some of the commissioners calling us for, and I think we just have to understand if the rest of the commissioners agree.
I agree. Might it be possible for us to receive a very short survey so that we're all getting exactly the same question, you're getting exactly the same, so that you can use that as your inputs? That would be really helpful.
Yeah, and I think it could go faster if we use that method as opposed to all one-on-one interviews. Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah, and I'm hoping that Amal and colleagues, you can help us with that. I think that would be terrific.
Can I just say, speaking as one commission member, I would be fine with you skipping the input step. We've had so many conversations. We've had so many experts come in. You have so much direct access. I'm really not sure. I mean, I'll always ask questions, answer questions that are asked, but I feel a lot of confidence in you having an enormous base of knowledge and a sense of where we are. And so if you want it, I mean, up to you, of course, how you want to run it, but I really feel like everything that we do that slows us down from getting to something incredibly clear and provocative that we can look back 20 years from now and say that was the roadmap feels like it lowers our odds of getting there. So one commissioner's view.
Thank you, Roy. You know, appreciate it. I think we can do both fast. And I think I do like to give commissioners the chance. But I think speed is what I'm taking away from that, Roy. You know, whatever the process, but speed is important. Point taken. Any other thoughts? We didn't get much reaction, by the way. Well, let me ask a question that we didn't. You know, it's on the written here, but we didn't discuss it very much. So assuming we do have and we land very quickly, to Roy's point, the 4 or 5 priority big areas, there's a notion suggested here about having each of those areas then be worked by a couple of commissioners. And, you know, part of the reason for that, and I understand why it was suggested that way, is because of our rules, which is we really can't get more than 2 commissioners hanging out and coming up with stuff. So, but I think those commissioners can certainly get input from others and work with others, but maybe perhaps Lande or others can help guide us on that. But that's the reason for that architecture to it.
I think from a government perspective, certainly input can be collected from others. We just want to make sure that we're not having a daisy chain meeting whereby information is being passed along to create something. So if it's kind of one-way input that is then being amalgamated, if you will, by the 2 primary commissioners, then I think that would be fine. The other thing is those commissioners could simply just frame up a few things. We bring it back to the next meeting, and then we kind of push through as a collective what we think the major findings and elements are of those proposals that we really want to continue to elevate and go forward with.
So as a process point, Lande and others, and maybe we can think this through together, in the spirit of speed, again, taking, you know, Roy's push seriously, if in fact our next convening is going to be, the convening 9 is going to be, say, sometime in late August, say. I think we haven't settled the dates yet. We'll work that through. I think if we're going to be on pace here, it'd be quite good to come into that meeting, having had whatever inputs we've had, and Mary Kay and I have kind of put a proposed framing on the priorities, but to come into that meeting with a clear suggested or set of recommendations for what those areas are. Now, we could also, depending on our collective capacity and process here, have also had a couple commissioners start to work on that so that we come into that meeting, not just saying these are the 4 or 5 areas, but also here's the 4 or 5 areas, and here's actually some ideas in them or around them, what they could look like. Would that, I think that would be on pace, right, Roy, to meet your aspirations of pace? So we don't.
Yes. Yes, and I think it would also help with that would also accomplish another thing, which is the idea of deciding that we will have 4 to 5 areas without knowing what those areas are seems to me like a little bit kind of, chicken and egg, which is to say, if it turns out we just want to lean on one thing with a bunch of other stuff in the background, I'm not saying let's cut all the rest of it out, but just in terms of what we emphasize, maybe that's the right answer. Maybe, and so only by starting to do the work can we figure out, what the right number of priorities is even. So yes, that's a long-winded way of saying yes.
Okay. Governor Granholm, just to catch you up, Jennifer, one of the things, and I think hopefully we think you'll like this because you've been one of the people pushing us in this direction. I think what we've just been talking about is the idea that we very quickly want to get to where we have 4 or 5 max areas really prioritized for big goals, above and beyond our current long list of recommendations that we prioritize to focus on. It doesn't have to be 4 or 5, could be less, but we really develop them and get to what we think those are pretty quickly, which is what commissioners have been encouraging, so that by the time we get together for our next convening, we know what those are and have some substance or some content behind what those areas would be, with the idea of big goals around them. So that's kind of just more about catching up on where we are. Any other reflections? Mary Kay, any thoughts, or shall we go into just practical next steps now at this stage, just as we start to operationalize all of this?
I'm just grateful for the sharpening of the role of the commission, our relationship to the task force, and a road ahead that it sounds like we have internal unity, that we want to be bold and focused, which I think is a great outcome for this conversation. Thank you, James, for leading us through it.
Terrific. I'm looking to our colleagues from ITIF. Anmol, anything that we haven't covered, or any other commissioners? I think, do you want to talk through the next page, Anmol? Because you had a bit of a process description there for how we might work our way through these and on actual potential dates.
Sure. I think this is pretty much a restatement, just in a visual form that Monique put together of the plan that you had outlined. So I don't know if there's other questions on this. I know after this, we were meant to have a conversation that Lande would lead, which I think should, I think there's some of it's already been covered, sort of evaluating the work of the commission in light of the COVID. And then I wonder if this is actually a good time, Lande, to also start to maybe pull out what some of those priority areas could be, so that we can leave this meeting in good shape to move forward on what those could be.
I'm happy to take a stab at that, given I want to be try to do that in the context of the conversation that we've just had, so I can take a stab at that. I guess does that make sense to you, James? Because we were going to try to actually begin to fashion the conversation around really the impact of COVID-19 on the work that we've done up to date. And the way in which I have been thinking about it would be to hear from the commissioners on doing exactly what had been suggested earlier, I think by Carla, which was sharpening the problem statement first, and then pivoting from there to where we were with that Roy said, which is we have an omnibus set of potential recommendations. I think if we sharpen our problem statement, it could help us then figure out which of those recommendations could potentially bubble up for future work and deeper work by these pairs of commissioners. So that's been the way in which I would suggest we think about approaching it, if that makes sense to you, James and Mary Kay.
I think it does, particularly if it focuses on, I think Carla and I think Soraya also made this point around objective number 1 here. If you go to the previous page, Anmol, which is, what observations have we made, I think, about through this COVID moment. So we begin the work of objective 1, I think is what you're describing, Lande. But I think to Roy's point, though, I think my own sense would be to do the rapid version of what Roy and others suggested on number 2, and not try to do it now, but do number 1.
Right. No, that's what yes. I think that
okay.
If we do number 1, it will help us to lift up what some of the number 2 ones are later, but I don't know that we need to do that now. And the way in which I think about number 1 is I have a copy, I hope you all do too, of the progress report that we submit on or about May 1st. And we have, starting on page 4, the challenges for the future of work, which really are our problem statement. And we bucketed those out into 3 areas. And in my mind, it's most helpful to be thinking about and reflecting on the COVID-19 and the pandemic in light of some of the topics there, as opposed to some of the very specific problems within them. So, the way in which I have been thinking about it is, what is the impact of COVID on inequity, economic mobility, and low quality work? what has been the impact of COVID on work adjacent issues and quality of life issues. What is the impact of COVID on potential new challenges and new opportunities for work in the future? So those are the kind of the three framing questions that I have come up with. And I would be really interested to hear from any and all of you about, I guess, starting with number one, which is really inequity, economic mobility, and low quality work, and how we can sharpen that in light of the pandemic and where we are.
Well, I'm happy to jump in, Londe. One of the things that's been striking to me about what COVID has exposed is a wider set of vulnerabilities than we had actually properly anticipated, if I could put it that way, which is, I think that I've just been surprised by the sheer size and scale of the vulnerable workers, where vulnerability is defined by either people who actually lost their work, or have been furloughed, or have seen their hours reduced, either because their sectors collapsed or for health and safety reasons. I've been struck by how big that number is in California. I've also been struck by how many of them, the majority of them, I think the numbers, and we have some analysis and numbers on this, how close to 80% of them are people who have less than a college education, and how the geographic footprint of those vulnerabilities is very, very high, and how close to about half of them work in small and medium-sized businesses that are not able to support them much, if any, at all. So to me, the size and shape and the types of vulnerabilities are much larger than I actually imagined. And I don't think we'd fully anticipated and contemplated that in the work that we had done before.
Yeah, James, I think you're absolutely right. And I think I'm spending a lot of time these days looking at a fairly fine-grained analysis of what's going on in the state. And you're absolutely right. And I think it actually has very significant implications for our work, as well as some lessons that are fairly clear going in from what we were thinking before. And let me say, I think it mostly reinforces, does not contradict many of the things we were thinking about before the pandemic, and goes back to, I think, a frequent comment here, that it accelerates, deepens, and gives greater meaning to a number of the kind of recommendations that we were thinking about, particularly around equity. The equity issue, more than anything else, has come to the fore as a result.
Maybe I would just add here, something that's, I think, been interesting is just the way we're trying. Clearly the inequities are, writ large. I mentioned criminal justice, homelessness. I mean, there's a lot happening there. But I just think another thing that's being highlighted is, like, the ways we've had in the past to solve these problems, the mechanisms we use to solve these problems are missing the mark in many cases. And I would use as examples the obvious points that the PPP from the federal government largely missed the businesses that are owned by Black people, people of color in low-income communities, and that the mechanisms that we have, the banks particularly, service their typical customers first, and there were incentives for doing that. And we do have a tier, as Betty's point, of CDFIs that now they're saying, oh, maybe we should be using these community development financial institutions, but that wasn't done in the first analysis. And then the obvious point Mary Kay made, profound point, that maybe for the union janitors, she's setting up a wonderful program, but what's happening for the other 500,000 janitors that are working in small, so it's like the mechanisms that we have had and used to address these problems exacerbate these inequities. They don't resolve them. And I think that's been really profoundly evident in this crisis.
That's really helpful. Roy?
Yeah, I actually think, by the way, Carly, just to double click on that for a second, I think this question of mechanisms is an important one, because if you think about even some of these work adjacent issues and even the portability of benefits, much of those mechanisms, to the extent that they work at all, but to the extent that they do, they often are tied to employers. But if employers are no longer employers, then that mechanism for solving those things doesn't apply, right? So I think your point about mechanisms is a really, really insightful one.
Great, thank you. Roy, next.
This is, in addition to agreeing with everything that's just been said, this is beyond just the pandemic, but I think given what's going on in our country, unless we put race and particularly the treatment of Black Americans much higher up in the priority of what we'd focused on, I think we'll be missing an honest analysis of what's happening. And, you know, I say that with full recognition that I'm not personally the most qualified person around the table to say that, but I do think it'd be remiss on us not to have that as a serious conversation. The second thought I have on inequity is, well, I'm not sure if it belongs in this category, but I think it does, is I'd actually love if we have data on whether the remote work transition is threatening the tax base of the state. You know, anecdotally, I'll just say I'm in many, you know, kind of private WhatsApp groups with people in the technology industry, and the wealthier someone is, the more vulnerable it seems that their presence as a continued taxpayer in California is. And if their employment at one of the big technology companies or sense of needing to be local kept them here before, that gravitational pull's been lessened. And I just don't know if that's a anecdote issue or the data actually supports it, but, you know, if we should figure that out, because that's how we're going to pay for some of this stuff.
That's super helpful, and just for what it's worth, and some data that I was looking at recently, some of the preliminary data is showing that while there is a higher degree of mobility of Californians, particularly from some of the large, more expensive urban areas to other places, a fair number of them are staying in state and moving to other places within the state of California versus leaving. And so it could, in some cases, be having an impact on our tax revenue, but I mean, it will, and it remains to be seen. But in many cases, people are choosing to be mobile to other parts of California, particularly with the increased prevalence of remote work. So just an interim data point. Well, I'm sure we'll learn more about that. Mariana, did you have a comment?
Yeah, one thing, agree with all that's been said. I mean, one thing is thinking about the economic recovery, and in some ways this recession, different from previous ones, is really caused by a service sector collapse, which is really different, right? So like all of these service industries, restaurant, childcare, you know, janitorial, brick and mortar stores, like, have all shut down. And so you see higher rates of those in terms of unemployment, underemployment. And so just reiterating James's point is, like, what does that mean in terms of a safety net and benefits? And what does that mean for the whole service industry? Is that is been the industry that has grown faster, and where there's a concentration of low-wage workers that had, once they lost their jobs, had zero income security. So just thinking about, like, sectorally or like by industry is important in terms of the economic impact, and the kind of what does that mean permanently for the economy and the government's role, if given that there's the employment relationship is shifting.
Thank you. Let's see, Doug, and then John.
Thank you. I'm having a hard time organizing my thoughts this afternoon, so bear with me here. I want to start with an anecdotal comment based on Roy and Mariana's examples. So in the last couple years, we've been part of Silicon Valley Rising, which is the largest worker organizing effort in the United States that I know of in the last decade. And it's been over 5,000 security officers, food service workers, and bus drivers who all work for contractors of Google, Facebook, Apple, the big high-tech companies, have organized into unions. And now, and those are all workers of color. and now they're all out of work. And to the credit of some of the tech companies, people were paid during the pandemic, but now you're hearing announcements of these companies who are just going to remote work, which probably makes sense. And I don't think we have any idea of how that's going to change as people move away, what it's going to mean to local government. For the workers who have organized with us, it's absolutely devastating. For the non-union workers who work in the delis, the restaurants, and everything around these campuses, devastating. Local government tax revenues, I don't know. As I look at these 7 bullet points in this about the challenges, the inequities that we issued, again, I think we were spot on, especially the comments in number 7 about the social safety net and how we're going to need to look at the greater need for care. It says, and the ongoing possibility of significant workforce disruptions. But again, we didn't imagine disruptions like this. And what I think is missing from this, and I'll say it again, is that while we talk about the accumulation of wealth, to John's point, a lot of people have gotten rich, you know, and back to these high-tech companies, there's a lot of wealth there. You know, they were on display in Washington, D.C. yesterday, the CEOs of the big tech companies. And some people are talking about antitrust and things like that. How we fund government, how we fund social services, how we fund infrastructure, whether individuals who are wealthy and corporations that are accumulating wealth are paying their fair share. Some of those questions are going to be on the ballot this November, and our commission doesn't take positions on ballot initiatives. But to me, in this pandemic, those are the big questions that are missing from our report, and I would like to dig deeper into those.
John?
Yeah, thank you very much, Londe. And I'll just sort of piggyback on previous comments quickly from Doug and Mariana as well. You know, I think obviously, as we've said a number of times, the COVID-19 crisis has not so much created problems as exposed underlying pre-existing problems. And I think nowhere is that more clear than in the safety net. And so I'd also like to speak about number 7. You know, I think we really did have a period of time when, and this is really, I think, important to keep in mind when we think about mechanisms and which mechanisms are necessary, particularly if there are new mechanisms we might want to consider. For a long period of time recently, the idea that, you know, technology could create work that would replace the need for jobs and employment, and that in fact, it itself could be a safety net that workers could rely on when they are in between more stable forms of job, and that flexibility, quote unquote, was a benefit that could be taken advantage of and used to smooth over the rough patches in the labor market, I think has been exposed as a failure. We had millions of workers who were relying on jobs like rideshare, for example, who automatically found that the so-called flexibility that they were counting on wasn't there when the demand for rides fell by 85% overnight. What those workers really found that they did need was an unemployment insurance check. And in our system, either we have those unemployment insurance benefits prepaid by employers, or they have to come from some other source. And so if we want to talk about mechanisms to provide a safety net that are different from those which have been established, we can't kid ourselves into believing that we can just snap our fingers and create resources out of thin air. If you want to change the funding mechanisms for these fundamental safety nets, we need to see some very specific proposals. And I think a much more promising route is simply to strengthen and expand and reinforce the structures that we have in place, which are clearly not adequate to the task right now, but to abandon them would be a wholesale disaster. And so I think that's I'll leave it there for now.
Monday, can I speak?
Please, please.
Thank you. You know, it's kind of like the government person on this panel. I look at all of these points and I think about, you know, what's really within our reach to affect. And I also want to add my voice to the strengthening of the social safety net. You know, so much of the vulnerability that we saw was because, you know, workers couldn't rely on a safety net. And so there wasn't much choice in terms of what they had to subject themselves to, putting themselves in danger and at risk of their health in working. But, you know, the other part of this that I think I don't want to forget about is that we're talking about, you know, how to sharpen this in light of the pandemic, but this is not going to be the last pandemic that we see. And so when I think about how we prepare ongoing, and in so many ways, you know, the other part of my time that I really spend a lot devoting attention to is on the climate crisis. And, you know, we're going to see very much similar effects in terms of the impacts on workers with the climate crisis, and the very issues of public health are going to be just as visible with the climate crisis. But I think throughout all of this, government has the ability to think about, and hopefully be informed by this pandemic, but to think about going forward, how do we not put workers in this kind of peril again? You know, how do we strengthen the safety net to where, yes, there may be job displacement, but it's not where the choice has to be such that there is no choice for workers about how to stay safe and healthy and protect their families. And so this is one aspect that I think kind of almost elevates above all the other points in this particular category, because unless we do that, we're all kind of paying for the impacts of not strengthening the safety net. And then we'll find ourselves with finite resources to where, you know, then it really has impacts on other aspects of our economy and society. So I would put a premium on the modernization, the strengthening of the safety net.
May I throw one quick comment in there? Eddie, you're absolutely right. There's a very high probability that we are looking at an extended pandemic, that we will be in this environment for anywhere from a year to 2 to even 3 years, that getting it now under control, we've lost control nationally of it. And the economic consequences, you can't get the economy going until you solve the pandemic, is that this may be a full-blown depression over the next few years. And so the issue of the safety net becomes incredibly important because it will need to persist and be much stronger than anything we have experienced since the 1930s.
Yeah, if I could also just jump in on that point, if I could, to connect what Peter just described and what Betty described. Maybe somebody on this commission or some of you knew something, but if you all recall, one of the linkages we had between the safety net point was with our recommendation number 12. And it's just interesting that when we wrote it, again, somebody on this commission must have known something. We highlighted, you know, climate, we highlighted public health crises, we highlighted a few different things that we thought we actually needed to be prepared for and be adaptive to, and also linked it in our narrative to the safety net question. So somebody knew something. I don't know if that was you, Betty, or Peter, but somebody knew something.
Unfortunately, the pandemic was the most predicted discontinuity. It's not a black swan, it's a black elephant. It was in the room all this time.
Mary Kay, did you have a comment?
Yeah, I think what I'm hearing is commissioners react to their ideas kind of in a group about priority areas to focus on, which I think is a great kickstart to the earlier conversation. And I just wanted to add my thoughts, Lande. Is that?
Absolutely.
Okay? Yeah. One of the things that John and Doug's comments made me think is, if you consider that as a tune-up of the problem, what is the moonshot recommendation that would tackle that problem? And one thing I've been thinking about in my mind, and it deals with political will on the part of all of us in civil society, government, corporate leaders, union leaders, community, of are we prepared to make a commitment that for me, and you could describe the moonshot in different ways, we're gonna end poverty wage work in California. And the 7 million that did exist, and now it's 9 with the additional unemployment from the problem statement we did, we're gonna figure out a set of interventions that eliminate the oxymoron of poverty wage work. And for me, it was triggered by strengthening the social safety net, which I support. But I think all of us who work in these communities understand that people want a decent job so they can lead a good life and provide for their families. And I just think we should figure out what can we, in this moment that you just spoke to, Peter, what is the 21st century New Deal that's going to take major investment that doesn't exist, just as John, but let's imagine it could exist. We just moved $4 trillion out of the federal government in the past 4 months, and we have no massive jobs program as a result of that 4 million. And so there was a set of choices and priorities made with that 4 trillion. And if we could rewrite our history, would we have opened up the cleaning corps or the conservation corps or the road and bridges corps? Or there's a lot of damn work that needs to be doing. And it's just a question of investing. So that was one thing I just wanted to add to the gathering post on SocialNet, because I do think we have to push ourselves to imagine a scaled way to get 7 million people in our state, primarily Black and brown, primarily women, into decent jobs that don't exist. And this is our time. We're being called to make it happen, it seems. And the second,
may I just say something on that point, if I may?
Yes.
Very good point. There's the concept in political science of the Overton window, which says that when something really big happens, this policy range, what's possible politically changes. And the Overton window has opened very, very wide. And so the opportunity to think big in exactly the way we meant it. And we could have a New Deal for California is almost the size of America at the time of the Great Depression. Why can't we be the source of the New Deal?
I totally agree. And then the second idea I had is I was listening to the news reports, because I'm staying in place in San Francisco as opposed to being in DC, which I have found quite a blessing just in terms of imagining what's possible. And when we were in Stockton and we heard about the super commute into the Bay Area, we know that super commute got disrupted by COVID. What could we co-create with Stockton that would be the incubator for the revival of areas that have always been shut out in our state? Because we now have remote workers that want to stay, but no small business to support it, no whatever. Is there a big thing we could do that would break through in the Central Valley, where we know the inequity is greater than any other place in the country, as we heard? That was my second thought about it. And then on the social compact, I just want to connect the heartfelt social safety net to a requirement that we figure out how to create enough work for people that want to do it, that the safety net is in fact a safety net for people who can't work. Because there's too many people in the goddamn safety net, excuse my language, that are working 3 jobs. And that's just wrong, and we got to end it. It's immoral and it's wrong. And so I do think the other thing I want to call us to is how can we reimagine a safety net? Because it's been shredded and it exists for too many people that are working for a living. And then my other thought, the other thing I wanted to add is this telemedicine thing that Wade spoke to is going to cause huge displacement for healthcare workers. And the healthcare workers on the lower end are going to be hit the hardest. So what if we intervened, because it is leapfrogging, and we opened the path that Sararu's talked about at the top and allowed all the service and clerical workers access, the incumbent workforce access to the shift in telemedicine, one, and two, trained them up to be the community health core that we need so that people don't have to travel, and we can create the neighborhood health systems that we have the beginnings of with home care workers and child care workers in people's homes that could learn to do preventative medicine and connect in. I think the thing that I wanted to offer is, what new work can we imagine that replaces work that people never wanted to do anyway, that actually feeds their souls and makes their hearts sing? Was the other thing. Those are some of my COVID thinking, James, that's been informed by the task force, but also the commission's work in the previous time, and frankly, dealing with the crisis in my own union of all the service sector jobs being in a total crisis in the way that Mariana spoke to. Thank you, Londe.
Thank you. I know Governor Granholm hasn't had a chance to speak. I want to see if she has a comment, and then I have Roy next.
I feel a little bit at a disadvantage because I had to jump out, and so I missed part of the conversation. I just so love what Mary Kay just said, every bit of it. And so my question to you all, particularly those who are on the task force, is, are they thinking like this on the task force, or do we have a lane that they're not already occupying? And I know you probably already discussed this. So if we pick these 4 areas or 3 areas and think big, we're not going to be overlapping. I just hate to be duplicative, and we want to be relevant.
Yeah, if I could just respond to that very specifically, Jennifer, there wouldn't be an overlap, because one of the things that's become very clear, and Mary Kay and I are on the task force and also on the operational committee of it, is very much focused on the here and now. So I think if our lane are the big structural, New Deal, new social compact kinds of ideas, that is territory that isn't overlapping with the task force. So that's why I love the kinds of big ideas that Mary Kay was suggesting. And also, quite frankly, Peter, when you comment about the Overton window, that's actually what I had in mind at the beginning when we say, this is a unique moment, actually.
Yeah, for sure.
We can think bigger than we could have thought about a year ago,
yeah.
Right? Because the system was so much more constrained than it is in this moment.
Great.
Thank you. Roy, contribute to the big moment thoughts.
Yeah, right. I'll try my thought on Mary Kay's question. And I do think one of the areas where we could use guidance, James and Mary Kay, from both of you, is how constrained by practicality ought we be in this group? Because if there's ever a group that is relatively, compared to other powerful institutions, less constrained, it's us, right? We're not signing anything into law. We're making recommendations. And so if we self-censor, shame on us, I think. And at the same time, we want to have an impact. The request I'll make about types of jobs that we could look at, which I do think would require some more work, it's come up before, but since it came up, which is jobs doing science, like university research jobs, which can be middle wage. I'll use the Saru's correction was very helpful on that. Oftentimes the skills that healthcare workers have can be repurposed into those contexts. And since the last time we met, while I know this isn't a political body, Biden's economic plan called for greater funding. The need for it around COVID became more apparent, because if we don't need more researchers working on a vaccine, I don't know what we need. Both the House and the Senate introduced bipartisan legislation, the Endless Frontiers Act, to dramatically increase national funding for R&D. Where is California in that conversation? I don't know, but certainly if we have an anchor, that's one of the large employment, enormous social impact, government has to do it, potential anchors. So that's my thought.
Thank you. I know we only have about 5 minutes left as a part of this conversation, and while we have focused largely on some of the challenges, I'm wondering if anyone would like to opine on some of the new opportunities that we talked about in the problem statement around the future of work. Anyone? We got the new opportunities all right.
Well, I think in some ways what Roy just described, I think is one of the new opportunities, actually, because the kinds of investments into the kind of, whether it's R&D and research for the kinds of jobs that we want, I think we now have, I think, an expanded view on what, on what the opportunities could be and what the jobs could be. And I think tying that into some notion of a jobs program, as Mary Kay has described, I think starts to be part of the opportunity set that we might reframe and expand. So at least I heard Roy speaking opportunity and adding to that frame.
And Londe, I think the particular focus on workers in transition, as we're rethinking the safety net, I think that's something that the safety net has to accommodate. We are going to see a lot more movement from jobs to jobs potentially, and so and to Mary Kay's point, we don't want to see more people in the safety net than actually working in quality jobs, and so I do think that's a function of the safety net, is how we support workers in transition without losing earning power or purchasing power.
Great.
Yeah, Betty, if I could just jump in and agree with you, maybe expand on that a little bit. I think, if I remember correctly, so I remember looking at the notes before this meeting, I think when we pointed out the workers in transitions in discussions previously about number 7, which is the safety net, I think at the time we were mostly anticipating transitions from impact of technology.
Technology, right.
was the key thought. I think we hadn't thought about other transitions that we now see in this moment. So I think the transition population, if I could call it, the worker population, is probably expanded more than we had anticipated, and which makes the safety net and even the transition discussion a much larger discussion than it might have been before.
Great. Doug.
Yeah, I really appreciate some of these comments, and particularly Mary Kay talking about $4 trillion going out the door with no real jobs program. And that's $4 trillion that's been added to the deficit. And I feel like I sound obnoxious saying this, but I just want to remind folks that Jeff Bezos is on pace to become the world's first trillionaire in 2026. So I put that in light as I think about the deficits that government's taking on, how my children and future generations are going to think about how to pay for that. So I like what we put down on paper, but I'd like us to have a discussion and look at how we could be creating these jobs programs and how to pay for those without shouldering future generations with debt. So again, this question of how are we paying for infrastructure development in this country? How could we be paying for a jobs program? And that's right in line with the discussions we had at this commission about the state, our budget being a values document, a reflection of our conscience, and how we put our money where our mouth is and invest in creating quality jobs for the future.
Thank you, Doug. Any final comments before we close out this part of our session?
Londe, it's Maria. I just want to make one comment. Just on this point, and again, I know I said it at the beginning of the call, but I think as I hear the comments, I really think there's an opportunity to leverage some kind of alignment or partnership with the governor's task force. Londe, even in the innovation subcommittee, how there was been discussion about workforce and how to look at training programs and possible investments that could be made. So I just think there's more to explore there. And to the extent that we can do that and have maybe this commission can create that big idea that the task force can take on, I think there's just an opportunity there. I'm just hearing a lot of very similar comments across from this commission to some of the committee work that I've had a chance to participate in.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And I think, you know, certainly the topics themselves are very, very aligned, and you know, the timeframes and how we want to think about them and how we scale the size of some of these interventions that we are talking about to the moment, I think is important. I think Roy mentioned, you know, are there any natural constraints that we need to be aware of? And certainly if we want to create something that big, we also know that the state is emerging from a fairly significant deficit, very, very little by way of resources to spend in terms of major programs, save having, you know, some resources flow to cities and states, not just California, but all over the nation, to really support this recovery. And so one of the things, as Maria and Mary Kay and James and others know, is that a part of our work on the task force has really been around federal advocacy and making sure we're having a voice in Washington, D.C. to let them know that we, you know, want to make sure that the people of California, all of the people of California, are well cared for. And so that is also something that each of you in your individual, you know, capacities could certainly contribute to. But I wouldn't want us to imagine something as robust as the way in which we have talked about, you know, redesigning and restructuring something like the safety net, and put that with the task force, and then tell the task force that, you know, they're advisory to the governor, and there's actually, that's my dog, there's actually very little by way of resources to support some of that work. So I just want to be mindful of what we can do and how we think about timeframes so that we can actually tee up some things that I think can help to contribute to a recovery as we do have the resources to support some of those items. I will actually pass it back maybe to James or Mary Kay for a quick summary before we move very quickly to the 2 or 3 public comment items that we have and before we close out. So I don't know which of you would like to take that.
Mary Kay, do you want to?
I'm happy if you will, James.
Well, I can certainly describe at least what I take away, because I know we need to wrap quickly to get to public comment here, but I think at least I take away that, you know, this is a very good discussion. I think we actually got some really insightful comments and ideas on our objective number 1 here, which is to really understand, you know, what is it about COVID moment that we would want to make sure we reflect in our problem statement. So I think we've gone some ways in doing number 1 on our objectives, but we need to capture it all. And I think Soraya and others made comments about really, you know, having some facts and all those kinds of things to support number 1, I think is important. So that's, I think we did some of that. I also take away that there's a huge appetite in this group to very quickly get to where we have the 4 or 5 big arenas where we want to be, you know, somewhat unconstrained, have some bold things to put on the table. And I think even some of those started to creep into this conversation already. I can already sense it, but I think it was, you know, without prejudging where we'll end up, I think the ideas around a really ambitious jobs program, something around a really ambitious articulation of a new social compact, or what that might mean perhaps with regards to a rethought or refreshed, reframed way to think about, you know, safety nets. I think, you know, not to say those are the only 2, but you know, our conversation was kind of headed in that way. So that's another observation. But I think at this stage, let me just suggest we wrap by saying, let's not get practical. Let's just actually do the work, schedule the next meeting, make sure we come to it, having given it the thoughts and you know, ideas that Roy and others encouraged us to try to get to sooner rather than later. And I think, Maria, your comment, which you made, was also echoed in previous conversations today, that we should think of the task force as a partner and a collaborator. And there's a lot of overlap, but there's slightly distinct lanes to some extent, which is the task force is very much a collaborate on a vehicle for many of our ideas. We should leverage it that way, but it has a much more immediate focus to it, whereas I think the commission is a little bit more forward-looking, hopefully is going to focus on some bigger structural things. So those are overlapping goals, but somewhat distinct lanes is kind of where we came to, I think.
Brilliant. I totally agree with that synthesis, James. Thanks so much.
Great. And with that, we're going to move.
This is such a great group. So back to you, Lande.
Thank you. Thank you. We're going to move to public comment. We have 3 individuals teed up for public comment. We're going to get through them in the next 5 minutes because I know a number of people have hard stops at 1 o'clock for their next meetings. So if we could start, I believe we have Ana Alvarado on from the California EDGE Coalition.
Good afternoon, commissioners. Can you all hear me?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. My name is Ana Alvarado, Policy Director at the California EDGE Coalition. We are a statewide advocacy organization focused on workforce development and economic mobility for all Californians. First and foremost, EDGE acknowledges all of the great work the Commission and Task Force have accomplished thus far, given the circumstances under COVID-19, in addition to elevating the importance of racial justice and equity within California's workforce. On behalf of our coalition, we submitted a comment letter supporting the intent and initial areas of recommendations outlined in the Commission's progress report. In particular, we strongly support and hope to see the expansion around elevating job growth and access to quality jobs, improving access to new career pathways, and to create industry-wide collaboration. EDGE is also in support of the latest efforts of the Cradle to Career Work Group, which is currently considering adding information around adult learners, apprenticeships, and career pathways into the statewide longitudinal data system. Finally, we would also urge the Commission to continue drafting the final recommendations through a racial equity lens in order to ensure employment and workforce education opportunities are accessible and provide support services to underserved communities. Thank you so much for your time, and we look forward to continuing the discussion.
Wow, that was perfectly done. My timer went off exactly as you stopped. Next, we have Cal Soto.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Cal Soto. I'm the Workers' Rights Director at the National Day Labor Organizing Network, NDLON, and I'll be quick. I appreciate you discussing big ideas today, but the progress report you provided in April, I think, barely mentions undocumented workers, I think only explicitly one time in a parenthetical. And this is at least 10% of our workforce here and probably more with respect to frontline workers. So for our members at worker centers that serve day laborers and other low-wage immigrant workers, many undocumented, the reality has changed drastically since the pandemic. So we have a forthcoming report of our member organizations that show at least 35% of our affiliate worker centers across the country have members and staff that have contracted COVID, and even others have many deaths as well. The suffering is immense. So I want to just say very clearly that any response by this commission that does not address our entirely inadequate safety net and labor protections for undocumented Californians will be fatal to the future of workers here. So I'll quickly offer my frame for a moonshot idea in this area. What can you all do as your recommendation on a state level to create functional institutions that stop avoiding and ignoring undocumented workers? For example, proposing a parallel state unemployment insurance system that includes all Californians, including our vast undocumented population that has saved our lives in this state during this and many other crises. And that's my comment for today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cal. Appreciate that. Our final commenter is Sheena Paul.
Hi, can you all hear me okay?
You can, thank you.
Great. So again, hi, my name is Sheena Paul, and I am the Economic Justice Policy Coordinator at the California Immigrant Policy Center. For years, CIPC and our partners have fought to change California's policy choices that have historically diminished the future of work for low-income people, immigrants, and communities of color, and forced these communities to languish in poverty. Today, many workers who have been segregated into low-wage jobs are being labeled as essential without being given access to the essentials they need to work and live with dignity. In California, over 67% of all frontline workers are workers of color, and 36% are immigrants. 30% of these frontline workers make less than $26,000 a year, and almost 1 in 10 workers do not have health insurance. The nature and structure of our state's economy has a direct connection to the disproportionate death rates and economic impacts on communities of color. This devastating reality must not be our future. The future of work also must not be a future where corporations profit from the very same pandemic that has brought so much death and devastation to our communities. To create an equitable future for workers, we want to see the Future of Work Commission continue past efforts to center the needs and solutions brought forth by directly impacted people from across our state. To echo several commissioners, we need you to be bold. We need you to help push our state leaders to undo generations of disinvestment and marginalization of communities of color. To do this, the proposals that this commission develops at future convenings must include robust support for undocumented immigrants and low-wage immigrant workers. We hope that this work will continue.
Sheena, thank you.
Thank you.
Finish up, that'd be great.
Oh, yes. Just one last thing. Just continue, the sense of urgency and commitment you all have, and thank you.
Thank you, Sheena. Appreciate that. And thank you to all of you. I know that it has been nice to see everyone's faces and also just hear all of the wisdom and all of the commitment to making sure that California's most vulnerable people are at the center and in the forefront of our minds as we make our way through the pandemic, through the economic crisis, through our racial reckoning. Someone sent me this morning, and I want to read it because I'm sorry to keep you, but I want to read it because I actually think it's worthy of thinking about as we exit, which is many of us have been thinking about the passing of John Lewis. And there was a quote, if I can find it, that he had, that I'm probably not going to be able to find now on the dot, but it really is a quote that's about being mindful of the moment that we're in and realizing that the work is not done, that the baton maybe that he was carrying for us has been passed on to us. And so that we actually have a responsibility to continue carrying that baton, and that as we think about all of these crises that are really at our footsteps, in our homes, at our front doors, that we need to be incredibly active and engaged and forthright and committed to making sure that not us as individuals, but all of us as a community really are taking steps forward to take care of one another, because that's how we make our way through the pandemic, and that's how we make our way through racial reckoning, and that's how we make our way through a new economic system that really serves all of us. So with that, I want to just say thank you to all of you for being engaged and for being with us. And Anmal and his team will be circling back with our next meeting. I've taken a ton of notes. I'm sure that Georgia has taken many as well, and we will make sure to get those notes out to you and some sharper next steps based on the conversation we've had today. So thank you all.
Thank you, Londe. Thanks to our Secretary of Labor, Julie Sue. James and I want to thank the commissioners for reconnecting and inspiring a path forward. James?
No, you said it perfectly. What I love about this group is it actually pushes us to try harder and aim even bigger and bolder, and that's a good thing. I think we all need that. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you.